Welcome to MagicGatheringStrat. I'm Dan, and this is Pauper Walkthroughs, episode 9, Delver. And to help me with this, I have Chris Weaver. Hi, Chris.
Hi, how's it going?
It's fine. Uh, I wanted you to do this because you had some success recently with Delver in the daily events.
Yep. I've got about 10 placings. You can't see all of them on MagicGatheringStrat because I do play at pretty odd daily events. I'm usually not in the big events that get posted, but I have been posted a couple of times.
Yeah. But first, I wanted to acknowledge that you actually do videos for MagicGatheringStrat.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to find an outlet. I was looking at all these Channel Fireball guys and MTGO Academy, and like, well, how do I get into this? And then I came across MagicGatheringStrat. I'm not sure exactly where, but came across the thing, and I saw that you were looking for video recorders. And I was like, I do streams all the time. I can figure out how to make videos, so started doing videos for MagicGatheringStrat. It's been a lot of fun.
It's only you and I that stream on TwitchTV on MagicGatheringStrat. There.
Yeah, Twitch is a really good outlet because it makes video recording really easy. You record your stream, and then you just directly upload it to YouTube. You don't have to mess around with video recording software and editing software and super long load times. So that's why I just do that with Twitch.
Don't you ever feel that your opponent could watch your cards on Twitch?
Yeah, but I think you're a poker player too, so for the most part, I already pretty much know what's in my opponent's hands, and sometimes I just act too hastily and I don't really play around what I should be playing around. But if I look back and I'm like, oh yeah, obviously he had that in his hand. So, but if my opponent sees my hand, if they're willing to cheat like that, well, you lose in the scheme of life thing. I don't like cheating. If you're bad enough that you search out who you're playing against to see if they're streaming or whatever, then, well, I guess you earned it. I have more fun playing Magic than you do cheating, probably.
Probably. Uh, Before we get into the Delver deck, let's talk a bit about you. How did you get into Magic?
I got in Magic during Tempest Block era. I was a fifth grader, maybe. Um, Saw a couple kids playing Magic at the lunch table. I was like, hey, this looks pretty cool. Teach me how to play. So I played it during Tempest Block mostly. I think it was actually like Weatherlight or something that was out back then. And I played along with Tempest and then Stronghold and Exodus, Urza Saga. So I got into it then. Mostly played super aggro, really cheap builds back then because I was a fifth grader. I had a $10 allowance, so I couldn't buy all that many Magic cards. So I was playing the cheaper stuff, but mostly it was just for funsies type of thing. As I graduated into high school, I dispatched of Magic because it was kind of a nerdy thing to do. And so basically I quit. It was a combination of actually Urza Saga's brokenness and the fact that you had to suddenly pay $400 to have a competitive deck. So I took a pretty long break from Magic. Came back right after Dark Ascension came out, and my little brother actually got me back into it. I was on vacation and visiting them, and my brother was like, "Hey, you want to play Magic?" I was like, "Yeah." I loved that game when I was a kid, and you know what? I'm just a big grown up kid now, so I was like, so I went and played some Magic with my little brother, and got back into the swing of things, and here I am today, about a year and a half later, I guess.
Yeah, that's
Still
actually
playing.
exactly when I came back during Dark Ascension.
Yeah,
And I had a 12-year-old break there.
yeah. So I don't know when Tempest and all that was out, but I like
97, I guess.
Tempest is
Ursa Saga was
97.
98.
Urza Saga was 98. Wow, yeah, it's been a while. So I was about 12 years old then.
Yeah, I think
12,
I quit
14,
the
14
first
years old.
time. I quit the first time when during Tempest.
Oh man, I love Tempest. Tempest was like that's probably my favorite block of all time. It's awesome.
Shadow.
Yeah,
So how did you find out about Pauper?
um, Pauper was sort of like my answer to my frustration with Standard. So I played Standard for a little bit. When I got back during Dark Ascension, it was Delver was pretty much the deck to beat. You played Delver, Geist of St. Traff. But I was at my core, back when I played during Tempest, like I said, I was originally an aggro player. And coming back to Magic after 15 years of, being away, I didn't really know a whole lot of the new mechanics, like Planeswalkers. I was like, what the heck are these things, So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to go back to my roots. I'll play some aggro. So during Return to Ravnica Standard, right after New Phyrexia and whatnot rotated out, went to Mono Red and, Hell Riders and Stormkirk Nobles and whatnot. And as the format continued to expand, you all of a sudden you had these Nye mid-range decks and these Jund mid-range decks, and there's just so many hate decks for Mono Red. And every time I played it, it was just like my opponent always had all the answers. So I just got super frustrated with Standard because I was like, well, if you want to be competitive in Standard, once again, you have to have a $600 or $700 deck to be competitive. So it's just like, you know what, I'm not willing to spend that much money in a deck, and then when the next block comes in, all of a sudden Jund mid-range isn't playable anymore, and you just spent $600 or $700 on a deck you can't even play in Standard anymore. So that was just like, wow, this is really frustrating. So I sold all my mono red cards and just basically bought pretty much an entire Pauper collection with it. There's a couple of key cards I still don't have, but Pauper was sort of my answer to be like, well, you know what, I can play with all kinds of different decks, and even if Stompy isn't playable in the current meta, then, I spend $30 on an Affinity deck, and all of a sudden I can play something again. Something that's actually competitive. So Pauper is just, I love the format. So much versatility, and it is rotating around quite a bit recently, as you've seen with Marcus, who plays Blue-Black Trinket Control, which, 2 weeks ago, pretty much everyone's saying, well, we can't play Blue-Black Trinket Control with all these Stormpost decks running around, because they just get trounced by the Stormpost decks. But, Marcus is playing his Trinket Control, and he's winning the heck out of games with it. By the same principles, when Empty the Warrens and Grape Shot and Invigorate were banned, Cloudpost took over. But it only took over for a short period, and then Stompy and Affinity moved in. And so it's like the meta, even though it's stable, it's eternal format, it rotates out frequently enough that you're not ever bored with Pauper.
That's very true. It actually rotates extremely quickly for an eternal format.
Yeah.
Do you remember? I think there is an early video on MagicGatheringStrat on YouTube where we played.
Yes.
I think you said that you wanted to play a Pauper game on video, and we did.
Yeah.
But then I got complaints from Power T that there was this guy named Cweaver that was beating him up when he was playing Trinket Control, and you were playing Stompy, and you were 4-0 against him.
Yeah, I played Power T for a little bit with Stompy because it's just I read the Blue-Black Trinket Control article, and I'm like, I've come up against this deck in practice rounds, at least 4 or 5 times. Every single time I just roll over them before they can ever do anything. But Power T and you had me convinced. It was like, well, this deck is supposed to have a pretty good win rate against Stompy, so he should be able to realistically beat me at least one game, or at least one match. So I want to see if he can put his money where his mouth is, and I'll try my Stompy deck. It had a pretty standard fare Stompy deck, and I just rolled him 4 matches in a row. It was I think he won 1 game out of the 8 that we played.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun, though. He was a really good sport about it.
Sample size creates weird things, but we actually have a big discrepancy in the amount of wins we have against Stompy. But that has nothing to do with Delver, so we should get back to our subject.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this deck.
Okay.
What attracted you to it in the first place?
What attracted me to this deck in particular was I was playing Stompy. Once again, I'm pretty much a core aggro player, although I'm starting to lean more towards tempo now with this deck. But at the core, I was an aggro player, so I was playing with Stompy, and I had pretty good results with Stompy. I placed in 3 or 4 dailies with it, but the meta shifted, and then all of a sudden, I couldn't play Stompy anymore. I lost I don't know, 5 dailies in a row with Stompy, and it wasn't even like, well, I went 2-1 and then lost round 4, or I went 2-0 and then punted round 3 and 4. No, it was like 5 rounds in a row where I was just 0-2 start or 1-2 start, and it's just like, man, I can't play Stompy anymore in this meta, and I wasn't really sure why. If it wasn't getting trounced by Familiar Storm, it was Delver's perfect God draws that just was like, well, Delver's a good match for me. How come I'm losing 0-2 to Delver decks? So I was like, you know what? I'm going to look back into Delver. It was actually the first deck that I tried in Pauper, which is a huge mistake, by the way. This is not a beginner deck for a Pauper deck. But so I started looking it up, and I actually think I think Pauper Walkthroughs is what got me interested into this particular variant of Delver, which is a much heavier control element than other Delver decks.
Maybe we should define there that I clearly see two very different Delver decks that are quite similar but different, and that's the XMIMX Aggro Delver and the Mezzel Control Delver.
There's actually like 3 variants running around. This is what I'm seeing now. You have the deck list that we're going to be talking about today is obviously it's the more controlling Delver. But you actually have the XMIMX Delver. And then you also have a new Delver deck that I'm starting to see pop up in the dailies, and that's the sort of hybrid aggro and control Delver. And those are the Delver lists that are running 4 accumulated knowledges.
Oh.
Which
XMIMX is playing right now, isn't he?
Is he? Is he?
I think so. I saw him streaming accumulated Delver.
Okay. Okay, because I was thinking the more aggro-centric versions of Delvers were the ones that weren't running accumulated knowledges, and they were not running the gushes or excludes, but they were more. So maybe that's where.
Maybe he switched. I think that's what's happened. He switched from the more aggro version to the accumulated knowledge version.
Okay. And we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm not sure accumulated knowledge is the right play here, but obviously people are posting tons of results with accumulated knowledge right now, and it's not something that I've experimented with, but it's definitely worth noting, and we'll talk a little bit about why I'm not playing accumulated knowledge as we go on in the interview.
This is pretty much why I only interview people with a lot of results, because then we can talk about the deck that actually got the results, so it makes for less speculation and more proven knowledge.
Yeah.
So this is the control version of Delver.
Yes.
Let's go through the card selections, the card choices you have made.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and start off with a 19 land base. I do want to say, though, that it's not actually a 19 land base. It's a 17 land base. The islands are the important cards here. Quicksands aren't really lands in this deck. They do function as lands, but they are definitely just kill target dude with power less than 2. That's pretty much their entire purpose, and they're uncounterable. So it's actually sort of an anti-Delver tech mostly, because if you try and use a Quicksand on a Stompy creature, they're just going to pump it in response. But it does make for some very interesting plays, and it makes them not use their pump spells early because you can sack the Quicksand in response and kill their thing. So it is a very defensive card. Anything else you want to add about the Quicksands there?
No. Why everybody runs 2 of them? Have you seen? Why exactly 2?
Okay. You never want to have a hand that looks like this. Quicksand, 5 blue spells. And if you run more than 2 Quicksands, you run into a pretty high risk of that. Ideally, you want to have at least 1 island in your hand. And if you're running 4 Quicksands, that's going to increase your chances of getting 2 Quicksands in your opening hand. That's just not what you want. Ideally, in your opening hands, you want islands, and if you have like an island Quicksand that's acceptable, but you need to understand the risks with keeping a hand like that. But like I said, the Quicksand is more functionally, the way I look at it when I'm looking at my opening hands is Quicksand is a kill spell. So if this hand is keepable at 1 land and 1 kill spell, then I'll play it. And some hands are acceptable, even if it's just island Quicksand and then 5 blue spells. Even if you can't necessarily, even if one of the blue spells is counterspell, that's possibly keepable. It just depends on what the hand is.
Yeah. Are you comfortable with 17 islands?
I am. I don't ever really feel flooded out or mana screwed. It's a trade off, but 17 islands and 2 quicksands also means that you've got 19 lands and you have a little card in the deck that we'll talk about in a little bit called Una's Grace, which turns all of your lands, even if you get flooded out, into cards.
Yeah, let's look at the creatures.
Okay, creature base. You've got a pretty standard fair creature base here. The notable exceptions being Phantasmal Bears, but let's go over your basic tenements that you pretty much have to include in any Delver deck, at least the Delver Fairy deck, anyway. So we've got 4 Delvers of Secrets, 4 Cloud of Fairies, 4 Spellstutter Sprites, 4 Ninjas, and 3 Spired Golems, along with 2 Phantasmal Bears. Delvers are pretty obvious. They're just pretty much the ideal turn 1 play.
There is a reason the deck is named after it.
Yes. So the other 1-drop in the deck, though, is Phantasmal Bear. And this is a meta call mostly, but if you're expecting a lot of control decks, specifically Stormpost decks in the meta, Phantasmal Bears are great because they are instantly putting them on clock. I've heard you say before that Phantasmal Bears were mostly for the Storm matchups, right? Just to make them have to answer you or to go off faster. And it functions the exact same way in Stormpost decks. Phantasmal Bear is a 10-turn clock by himself. But when you start combining him with all the fairies and the ninjas and the flip delvers and stuff, he can just make that clock, a turn or 2 faster. So that's why we're playing Phantasmal Bears. And he's also a great target to just ninja in the second turn. If you're facing against a Cloudpost deck, you might want to make that play where you start ninjaing in and drawing lots of cards, drawing extra cards every single turn and making them answer your spells. So that's why we have the Phantasmal Bears in here. So I guess we move on to the 2-drops.
Yes.
Unless you have anything else to add. Okay. 2-drops are Clouds of Fairies and Spellstutter Sprite. Cloud of Fairies it's a fair card in Delver. You're just paying, you're essentially getting a free 1/1 flyer. They have double utility, though, in cycling them. A Cloud of Fairies on turn 14 is just unimpressive. So you cycle them away. Unless you just need something on the board as a clock. I know I forget to cycle them pretty often. I've seen you forget to cycle them as well.
Yes, I always forget to cycle them.
But they also serve a super important purpose here, is that you want to have at least 1 Cloud of Fairies on the table on turn 2. And the reason for that is Spellstutter Sprite. Spellstutter Sprite, I'm sure most people understand what it does. We'll just go over it real quick. It says, when Spellstutter Sprite enters the battlefield, counter target spell with a converted mana cost X or less, where X is the number of fairies you control. So you have a counter spell on a stick here, with Spellstutter Sprite. But it's going to require that you have a couple fairies on the board to make it useful. So that's why we play 4 Clouds of Fairies. I've seen some lists running 3 Clouds, but I don't think that's right. I think you definitely need the full 4 fairies and the full 4 Spellstutters in this deck.
It used to be the case that people ran Zephyr Sprites and stuff main deck just to up the fairy count even more.
Yeah, but if you run Zephyr Sprites, they're not an impressive card by themselves. Cloud of Fairies, like I said, it has 2 uses here. You can cycle it away if you're in the late game and you just need a card that has an answer. And Zephyr Sprites you can't do that with. Zephyr Sprites are just a horrid top deck. Cloud of Fairies is not a great top deck, but it's better than a Zephyr Sprite. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And if you don't play that Zephyr Sprite on turn 1, then you pretty much lose its usefulness instantly.
Yeah. Yesterday I ran into a fairy that cost 1 blue and 1 colorless. It was a 1/1 flyer, and when it died you get to draw a card. I hadn't seen that card before, but that was in a Delver deck.
I've never seen that card either. But that's actually sort of what's cool about the Delver deck, because you can play around with different iterations. And that's sort of what I've done with the sideboards. I'm not going to talk too much about the sideboard right now, but I've definitely taken a little different spin on the sideboard than most Delver decks do. But that's the versatility of Delver.
Absolutely.
You can play around with things.
So let's talk about the only decent card to come out of the Kamigawa block.
Ah, the Ninja of the Deep Hours, indeed. This guy's just a beating. He serves incredible usefulness. Um, it's obviously it's a beat stick and it's a must answer threat because every time he's dealing you damage, he's drawing you a card. Every time he deals your opponent damage, he's drawing you a card. So I just want to talk about some of the versatility of the ninja with the spell stutter sprite here. This is pretty much the ideal interaction here. As you go turn 1 Delver, turn 2 blind flip the Delver, play a Cloud of Fairies, spell stutter their first spell. Well, the next turn you ninja out the spell stutter. Let's say you're out of gas. You ninja out the spell stutter, and then all of a sudden you have another spell stutter in your hand to counter their next spell. And they just can't recover from that. And they're at less than 10 life already, and you have a spell stutter in hand, and you've got 2 or 3 more cards in your hand by this point. So the ninja is mostly useful for just straight up bouncing your spell stutter sprite to reuse it. And that's why we can afford to run just 4 counterspells in this deck, whereas the more like the mono blue control decks have to find other counterspells they have to run because they don't have the spell stutter ninja interaction.
Yeah, it's really the way you lock out your opponent when you really despair when playing against Delver. When Ninja is down, Delver is drawing 2 cards a turn, you are drawing 1. And he's just sitting there with a grip full of counterspells.
Yeah, and they're there too, but like your opponent has to play the spell stutters because he has to get stuff out of your hand. But he knows they're there, but he can't not play anything because he's got a ninja and a Delver beating you down on a 4-turn clock. So it's like they have to play in the spell stutter. You're going to get super value out of it. And just like the ninja spell stutter interaction is what makes this deck. I think it's actually the ninja spell stutter interaction is probably more important than the Delver itself to the deck. It's just how Delver wins typically.
And having both of them is a real beater.
Yeah.
I think one important thing about the Delver deck in itself is that it is the only true aggro control deck in Pauper, and it will attract a lot of players from other formats that are familiar with Merfolk decks or other aggro control decks. And,
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It's been as long as I played Pauper, this has been a tier 1 deck, if not the number 1 deck.
Yeah, I've been told that there was before Delver was printed that the Fairies deck wasn't really a deck. I don't know because obviously I wasn't playing back then, but before Delver was printed, it was like you had a Fairies deck, it had some bears and some fairies and some spell stutters and ninjas, and it was okay. But Delver sort of pushed it over the edge. But I think what was making the deck back then was the ninja spell stutter interaction. It was just like your opponents were helpless against the ninja spell stutter beatdown plan.
Yep.
Once it got control, it just had it for the rest of the game.
So what about Spy Golem?
All right, so Spy Golem's an interesting choice. Obviously, it's Affinity for Islands. It's a 2/4 flying beat stick, but Spy Golem's a purely defensive card. In my opinion, anyway. We only run 3 because we don't want to see 2 in our opening hand, really. I think that's the golden rule. Is like if you don't want to see 2 in your opening hand, you only run as 3 at the max in your deck. But Spire Golem is a very, very defensive card, and it clogs up everything so much. Your opponents can't really properly attack into it, especially if you're leaving counterspell mana open. They can try and use a Vines of Vastwood or something to get through it and beat it down, but then that Vines of Vastwood just gets counterspelled and he just eats the Quirion Ranger or whatever they tried to use it on. So Spire Golem's a super defensive creature, and in the later games, it's also a pretty darn good ninja target because they're not going to block a Spire Golem because they can't really properly block it either with anything that they have. Spire Golem just swings through Muldrifters and opposing Delvers and whatever flyers your opponents might be able to play. Spire Golem pretty much swings into anything without worry.
Yeah. From what I understand, it's also the key card to beating other Delver decks.
It is. Well, it's one of the key cards to beating the other Delver decks. It's once you start getting those, if your opponent has a Delver on the board and he empties his hand, you play a Spire Golem, and all of a sudden his Delver can't attack. But nothing he really has can attack either because he just eats ninjas, he just eats all the fairies, opposing Delvers, opposing Phantasmal Bears, and he even trades Frostburn Weirds, which is pretty good. It's not the greatest, but you have to eat Frostburn Weirds if you can.
Yeah, looking back at the creature base here, if you had a meta where Phantasmal Bear was not very useful, what would you replace it with? Say, for example, a meta with only aggro decks.
With only aggro decks, I would probably just replace the bears with like a Frostburn Weird and maybe another Piracy Charm. Yeah, bears are pretty often sided out, but I think they serve an important purpose because your opponent, he can use like Quirion Ranger or whatever to kill it, and that's just unfortunate if that happens. But that's why we're only running 2 Phantasmal Bears. I'm not going to run my Phantasmal Bear into a Quirion Ranger, and if he uses a pump spell to kill my Phantasmal Bear, that's not even that bad because I do get to get a card out of my opponent to make him kill the bear.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at the spells.
All right. So the spells. All right. So the controversial spell here, a couple of spells here, are the Brainstorms and the Piracy Charms. After playing around with the Ponder and Preordain cantrip selections, I do like Brainstorm quite a bit, and I don't know that Brainstorm interacts well with other cantrips, actually. That sort of sounds counterintuitive, but Brainstorm is the cantrip that sort of does it all. Unfortunately, it does leave you with the possibility that, if you brainstorm, let's say you top deck a brainstorm late game, and you brainstorm and your top 3 cards are islands, you're just like, oh, I can't shuffle these away, I can't put them on the bottom. And sometimes it's bad. But there are other times when brainstorm is just sickeningly good. Once again, I'm going to use the Cloudpost deck here. So let's say you go turn 1 Delver, and then your opponent plays a turn 1 Cloudpost. At that point, during your upkeep, you just brainstorm and you flip the Delver instantly, and you put him on a crazy fast clock right away. And the other cantrips can't do that. You have to spend a mana using it during your main phase to flip a Delver, and that's just not always the best thing to do. And the other thing about brainstorm is sometimes you want to just have a grip full of good cards. And since we're running excess lands, if you have a hand, something like 2 islands and a counterspell in your hand, you can brainstorm, you can put those islands back on top, and then now all of a sudden your hands look something like 2 counterspells, a spell stutter, and something else instead of the 2 islands and a counterspell. So brainstorm can, it's good at filtering your hand and just making your hand better on key crucial turns. Like let's say you read your opponent for a Muldrifter and he's got to have counterspell backup. You can brainstorm and get a couple more counterspells in your hand and toss some of the worst cards from your hand on top of your library. So that's what I got to say about brainstorm.
You mentioned that it is an instant as opposed to Preordain and Ponder.
That's true. That is pretty important in controlling builds because, if you want to be able to leave open counterspell mana, can't believe I forgot to say that, but Brainstorm also, it does let you leave open counterspell mana. If you don't have a counterspell in your hand, you can still bluff it and leave it open, and at the end of the turn, if they don't do anything, thinking that whatever they try to play is going to get counterspelled, then you just Brainstorm at the end of the turn, and it's like, well, haha, gotcha, I didn't actually have a counterspell in my hand, but now I do because Brainstorm let me get one in my hand.
Yeah.
So,
I also find that it's quite useful to hide cards from discard with Brainstorm.
That's pretty true too. I didn't even think about that interaction because I don't usually play against cards running a heck of a lot of discard. But that is a very good interaction.
Yeah, when you get the rest, then you hide the stuff they can get, so the rest fizzles.
Yep. It's an awesome interaction. So, I guess moving on to the next spell on our list, we've got Piracy Charm. And Piracy Charm's pretty versatile. I've actually used all 3 versions of this card, believe it or not. So, Piracy Charm, target creature gains Island Walk until end of turn, or +2/-1 until end of turn, or target creature or target player discards a card. So, Piracy Charm is, like all charms, is pretty versatile. Mostly you're going to be using it as just a kill target dude with 1 or less toughness. That's its primary use. However, it's never a dead card against any deck. you can use the Island Walk ability to just squeeze through blockers, like opposing Delver blockers, for example.
Did you ever win a game on the Island Walk?
I have won a game on the Island Walk. Yeah, it's I was up against a Cloudpost deck, and he had played a Mole Drifter. I had like a Ninja on the table, and that was it. He was at such a low life total. I had like another Spire Golem or something on the board, but I knew that if he blocked at all, he was just going to stabilize because he had just played the Mole Drifter. He had like 6 cards in his hand. I drew a Piracy Charm. I'm like, man, this is just worthless. All I'm going to do is make him discard a card or something like that, or Lightning Bolt my thing, and it's just like, well, the only way I'm going to do this is if I Island Walk my Ninja to get it through for the last 2 points of damage, and it did. It got there. So I won on the Island Walk once. It was by a very small margin, but...
Very nice. This card doesn't feel blue, and it is a time-shifted card from the alternate reality of Planar Chaos, right?
Planar Chaos, yes.
Yeah, so it's really a black card, and I think it shows. And this has replaced Days in a lot of lists, right?
Yep, that's the card that it replaced in the... I think Mezzel had said that he was originally running Daze instead of Piracy Charm in this list, but he switched over and started running Piracy Charm, and he found out that it ran better. And I tend to agree. Piracy Charm's pretty useful. Once again, it's one of the cards you pretty much target to sideboard out in a lot of matchups, but it's never a dead card in any matchup. The worst case scenario, it does a bad Mind Rot impersonation, or it does a Mutagenic Growth impersonation on your own thing. So it's a 2 damage burn spell, or it's target player discards a card. And I have one on that too, target player discards a card. So let's say your opponent's in top deck mode, and you just need him to not draw anything for another turn, not draw another answer for another turn. And you put a stop on his draw phase, and you Piracy Charm him during his draw phase. So if he didn't, if it's not an instant spell, then he just loses right there, because the Piracy Charm makes him discard whatever he drew. It doesn't care, and you still maintain board control.
Yeah, that's
so it's sort of like
powerful.
So it can be like a preemptive counterspell for one. If your opponent's in top deck mode.
I was playing Mezzel Delver before he did this switch, and I discussed it with him, and I'm quite convinced that Piracy Charm serves a better purpose than Daze does in this build.
Yes, I think so too, because Daze is just too much of a tempo loss against certain types of deck. Let's say probably Goblins. I think will probably be the best example here. Daze is just a huge tempo loss against Goblins, and they're gonna spit Goblins on the board left and right, regardless of whether you daze them or not. And if you daze them, it sets you back a turn on land drops, and that can be really crucial whenever you're trying to drop Cloud of Fairies and Spell Stutters on the next turn, and you need to be able to counter their Goblin Bushwhacker, and it sets you back too far. Whereas the Piracy Charm can take care of their 1/1 thing that's gonna beat you for 2 with a Goblin Bushwhacker.
Yep. So, counterspell.
All right. Well, don't think too much discussion's needed on counterspell. It's just the most powerful counterspell. If you're running blue, you should probably. If you're running mono blue, you should probably be running 4 counterspells.
Yeah, I was surprised when the Stormpost decks cut it.
Well, they're a combo decks, so it's not that surprising if they've cut counter magic. I've heard somewhere that counterspells are bad in combo decks.
What about exclude?
Well, we didn't talk about Snap.
Yep, let's talk about Snap.
All right. So Snap is one of my favorite cards in the deck. It's so incredibly versatile that, most of the time you're just using it as an unsummon, as a free unsummon. However, there are much more fun interactions with Snap. Snap can serve a couple of different purposes. My favorite use for Snap, though, is snapping your own Spell Stutter Sprite to counter something else. And that's just such an incredible play. You use your Spell Stutter Sprite, and you have, like, a Snap in your hand, and that's it. And you're affinity opponent is just going to be dumping things on the table left and right, but he's, let's say you reveal the snap to flip your Delver. He knows you have a snap in your hands, and you snap your Spellstutter Sprite counters Carapace Forger. It's just, I love that interaction. I almost giggle with joy every time I hear it, or every time I do it.
Yeah.
And it also, that also means you get to save your counter spells for like the Mirror Enforcers and the things that Spellstutters can't counter. So,
yeah,
just an awesome interaction. All right, so we'll move on. Talk about excludes.
Yes.
Excludes are another like pet card of mine, because if you exclude a creature, it just puts you so far ahead in every sense of manner of being ahead you can possibly be. Counter target card creature spell, draw a card. So if you're playing these tempo plays and you've got them on a 4-turn clock already, and then you exclude their Muldrifter, it just puts them so ridiculously far behind in every way that they can't possibly come back, because you just get to draw a card, which is probably going to draw you another counter spell or a brainstorm or something that just puts them more far behind, and you got to get rid of one of their cards. So exclude's just crazy powerful. I love exclude.
I completely agree. I was so happy when I saw people started to include this in Delver lists, because it's just and excluding a Muldrift is kind of a 4-for-1 or something.
I don't even know. I think it's like 5-for-1. It's just crazy.
Yeah. Ona's Grace is a bit harder to. It's a bit unusual.
All right, Una's Grace is. I'm sorry, I gotta move here. Una's Grace is a late game card. It's a decent cantrip. You don't want to be paying 3 mana to draw 1 card, but in the later game, whenever you're drawing island after island after island, Una's Grace suddenly starts to look really good, because it's card advantage at that point in time. So yeah, it's pretty much your only real late game. You do have Gush to draw extra cards, but Gush is sort of like the emergency button, right? You push the big red button that says "Do not push" as an emergency. Sometimes Gush is just card advantage, but Una's Grace is just card advantage at its core. You just turn all your excess lands into excess cards, which draws you more counterspells or answers to whatever your opponent is doing.
How many lands do you play before you start discarding them to Ona's Grace?
Usually want to try and get probably 4 or 5 lands on the table. You want to be able to make your Spire Golems castable with double counterspell protection during some matchups. But I think it sort of depends on the matchup there, on when I'm going to start pitching Una's Grace for extra cards. If I'm playing against like a Goblins deck, once again, Una's Grace, I'm going to start pitching cards at 4 mana, because I'm not really worried about protecting my Spire Golem with double counterspells at that point in time.
Yeah.
So I'll start pitching extra lands. And if a Goblins game goes that long, you're probably going to win it anyway. But let's say against opposing Delver decks, you probably don't want to start pitching lands until you have a pretty good mana base on board. At least enough to where you can fight through 2 counterspells.
Yeah. And that's... do you have something more to say about Gush?
Yeah, Gush is a crazy card. It's what is it, banned in Legacy or something like that?
I think...
Banned or restricted in Legacy or Vintage. It's a crazy powerful card, and I don't see any reason why any Delver list should not be running at least 1 Gush. You sacrifice tapped lands to draw 2 cards, or you return tapped lands to your hand to draw 2 cards. That's the way I look at it anyway. And it also sort of helps you if you miss land drops. So let's say you're sitting at 3 mana and you miss your 4th land drop. You can tap 2 mana, play a couple Delvers or something. You return those 2 islands to your hand. You play another island, and all of a sudden you have a bigger board state, 4 cards in hand, and you have counterspell protection. So Gush is huge there.
Yep. And I think that this is one advantage of Control Delver over. I know that the aggressive Delver decks have started running Gush as well, right?
Yeah, they're typically running one at most because Gush can be kind of clunky, and it is also a tempo setback for your land development.
Yeah.
So I like running two though in this particular deck because it is one of your only hard draw spells that you're running in this deck that are.
Yeah, that was my point. That this deck actually has hard draw spells, and it can gain real card advantage by as aggressive Delver has a little bit harder to do.
Yeah, and I guess one of the other interactions with Gush is if you're in the late game and you have an Una's Grace in the graveyard, you can start pitching. You can pitch those excess lands that you used for Gush to Una's Grace.
Nice.
And draw even more cards. So there you go. That covers the main deck.
Yeah, I was thinking about one other thing before we leave the main deck.
Okay.
What goes through your mind when you're deciding whether to play a turn 2 ninja or not? Because it's like a critical play for Delver often, if it works or if it doesn't work.
It is a pretty critical play. It really depends on the board state and the particular holdings of my hand. And also whether I think that my opponent will play anything anyway, whether or not I do have a counterspell in my hand. So let's say I don't have any counterspells in my hand, but I can ninja out, a Phantasmal Bear ninja a Phantasmal Bear. I don't have any counterspells in my hand. I'm playing against like a Goblins deck or a Stompy deck or something like that. At that point, I'm probably going to ninja just to get it out there, just to make it to where they have to answer this card, or maybe even leave behind a blocker in the best case scenario for the ninja the next turn. At that point in time, I'm not worried about ninjaing or about bluffing counterspell protection. If I don't think my opponent's going to play anything anyway, then I'll definitely ninja on turn 2.
Yep, that makes sense. Have you ever ninja the ninja in response to removal?
Now, usually my opponents are smart enough to play around that.
Yeah.
I think I've done it once or twice in the tournament practice room, but usually my opponents are pretty smart about not playing into the double ninja play.
Yeah, and it's just remove the ninja during declare attacker's phase instead of declare blockers, and you're safe.
Yeah, that's usually the way it goes.
All right, let's move to the sideboard.
All right, so the sideboard's where my deck and Mezzel Delver kind of go on different paths here. So we'll talk about the 4 Hydroblasts. That's a pretty obvious answer. It's just like it's hose red decks.
Yeah.
Mostly it's brought in against goblins and blue-red cloud posts. Also it's brought in against like Delver Fiend. Just any deck relying on red cards in general, you're going to bring in Hydroblasts. You're bringing the full set of them because it's just so good. Moving on to the 2 drops, we have Boomerangs and 2 Deprives. We have 3 Boomerangs, 2 Deprives. Boomerangs are mostly brought in against Cloud Post decks, or decks relying on big mana drawing lands, like the Karu lands or Cloud Posts. And that's purely a tempo play. You're planning on killing your opponent before he can set up his huge mana advantage. And that's all Boomerang is there for, is just to take away that tempo from them and make it to where your Delvers and Phantasmal Bears can beat them before they can ever have an answer. Deprives is hard counterspells. I was previously running Logic Knots here, but Logic Knot, I found that Logic Knots are only really useful if you're running a lot of cantrips, a lot of ways to fill up your graveyard. So I just decided to go with Deprives, and once again, the Deprives work pretty well with the Una's Grace. You deprive, you return a land to your hands and counter target spell. Actually, is it a land? Yeah, it's a land.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you return the lands to your hand, counter spell, and that's fine. It's just a counter spell. Fairy Trickery was it's sort of an interesting spell because Pauper doesn't have Dissipate, if I'm correct.
That's true.
So, Fairy Trickery is your counter target non-fairy spell. If that spell is countered, exile it instead of putting it inside your owner's graveyard. And this is just a sort of handy thing to just deal with, like the flashback spells, for example. That's mostly what we're using it for. It's like an anti-mystical teachings card. It's also a hard counterspell for 1 more mana. which is fine by itself.
What about Dispel?
Dispel, I could see it happening, but I do want the Fairy Trickery because Dispel doesn't counter like Mole Drifters. That's one of the key things you're looking to counter with the Fairy Trickery is mostly just Mole Drifters, really. Because Mole Drifters is just so devastating to your game plan that you just want hard counter spells. But the Fairy Trickery also offers the versatility of being able to counter Mystical Teachings. And Mystical Teachings is one of the ways that Cloudpost has to just instantly come back in the game. Because, Resolved Mystical Teachings, you can counter the first one, but then they just flash it back and you get whatever they were going for anyway. But Fairy Trickery says, no flashback for you.
Yeah. I hate being Fairy Trickered on my Grim Harvests as well. Speaking about Mole Drifters.
Yes, Fairy Trickery on a Mole... I mean, there are cards which are very much, I want to be in the graveyard. I can Fairy Trickery like a Stinkweed Imp, for example, and that's just devastating play to my opponent because he's probably relying on that Stinkweed Imp to just go into the graveyard if he gets countered.
Yes.
But Fairy Trickery doesn't let him do that. So that's pretty much it. And as a cancel, it's fine. It's a 3-mana counterspell. That's fine on its own too. It's not great, but it's fine.
Yeah. And
sometimes you just want a 3-mana hard counter.
This is a card. Stitch Drake is a card I saw a lot of when it was new.
Yeah, Stitch Drake is just sick. It's 3 mana for a 3/4 flyer, and that's just awesome by itself. And the decks that you want to bring in Stitch Drake against are you're going to have a lot of creature cards in your graveyard anyway. Like the Stompy deck, you're probably going to be chump blocking Cloud Fairies or whatever, trying to trade. Against like goblins, they're probably going to be lightning bolting your Delvers or your Fairies or whatever to get it out of the graveyard. And Stitch Drake it's so good against every deck that you bring it in against. Cloudpost is, you're bringing it in against Cloudpost, blue-red Cloudpost, and they're going to be flame slashing your things and like triggering your Fairies, and you just play a Stitch Drake, and all of a sudden, boom, they just like, oh wow, there's a 3/4 flyer for 3, and you have counterspell protection open too. Dang, how am I going to deal with this thing now?
Yeah.
So.
And then we have a very unusual choice here. Snake Form.
Alright, Snake Form. I like Snake Form more than most, I think. And I'm actually kind of sad that this hasn't really caught on to other Delver players, but Snake Form it's a removal spell, essentially. And it's a pretty versatile one, right? You two and a hybrid green-blue mana. Target creature loses all abilities and becomes a 1/1 green snake token, or green snake until end of turn. Draw a card. So this card is just crazy in the decks that it's good against. It breaks up like Delver stalemates by you can Snake Form their Spire Golems, and all of a sudden your Delver just eats their Spire Golem, and you also draw a card off of that. So you draw into like a counterspell for their next Spire Golem they try to play. But it's mostly actually a tech used for Affinity, because one of the things I realized is that if Affinity resolves these Mirror Enforcers and these Carapace Forgers and whatnot, I don't really have a way to deal with them other than snapping them back to their hands and hoping to draw a counterspell for it next turn. So Snake Form is just a way to deal with bigger creatures.
Yeah, I was so surprised when my Carapace Forger was Snake Form when I played against Marcus. And
it's just a crazy play. You Snake Form the Carapace Forger, and all of a sudden that your Cloud of Fairies just trades with their thing, or when they block your ninja, the ninja just eats whatever they blocked with, and I got to draw another card in response.
Yeah.
So
I can see why it works, and I think it probably will catch on.
I think I used to play a mono blue control, and it ran 2 Snake Forms in the main deck, and it was just, when it was good, it was just sickeningly good.
Alright, last card, Serrated Arrows.
Alright, Serrated Arrows is it's hard removal. It's often at least a 2-for-1 on your opponent, and it just changes the course of the games. You know, if you're facing down a horde of goblin tokens, serrated arrows just eats goblin after goblin, turn after turn. It also just it sits there on the board and it just threatens to eat whatever else they play. You know, because it's got 3 counters on it. So if they're, you know, if they have like 4 goblins on the board, you kill one of them with the serrated arrows, and all of a sudden they don't really have a profitable attack. And then you kill the next turn with the serrated arrows. And even if you've only got like a cloud of fairies on the board, your arrows just they don't instantly stabilize the board, but they stabilize the board pretty quickly. So that's pretty much what I was looking for with serrated arrows. It was actually mostly for Stompy, was why I put it in the sideboard, because Stompy could just get a critical mass of creatures, and it didn't matter what I blocked, that, you know, they were just going to use the pump spell on anything that didn't go blocked. So serrated arrows is just a way to remove their creatures and make their top decks just less good.
Isn't 4 mana a lot for a 17 land deck?
It can be, but you do have the brainstorms to cycle through, and, you know, quicksands, while quicksands are a kill spell, they can also be used for mana. So you're running effectively 19 lands. You know, if possible, you know, if you really need a serrated arrows to resolve, you're not going to necessarily use your quicksand. Although definitely use your quicksand if the opportunity presents itself. But you're kind of looking to make it to the late game against Stompy, and if you can make it to the late game, you're probably going to get your 4 lands on, you know, whenever they're threatening a critical strike. You know, when they're threatening an alpha strike, you make it to 4 lands, and all of a sudden you remove their 1 excess creature that might have actually killed you with an arrow counter.
I've been moving back and forth on serrated arrows, but there are just so many matchups where it is good, so I think you're absolutely right here.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing is, too, it's really good against opposing Delver decks. If you resolve with serrated arrows, you pretty much just win against the opposing Delver deck.
Yeah. What about some other cards that you have considered for the sideboard and not decided to run?
Alright, so the other big sideboard considerations, you mentioned earlier a little bit, Dispel, and Dispel is one of them that I considered just replacing for Boomerang. Dispel's pretty good. You know, I used to run Dispels in my sideboard before I switched over to this. Just found that I didn't really need Dispels, and if I'm in a counter war here, then I want the hard counters more than I want the Dispels. Dispels are conditional, and, you know, Dispels don't hit Flame Slash, for example. And Dispels just don't hit enough. And if your opponent's like on the Spellstutter plan where he's gonna counter war you with a Spellstutter sprite, then Dispel doesn't work there either. So I don't like the conditional counters, so I'm just not gonna go with Dispel there. Some of the other ones are like Steel Sabotage, which is fine. You know, you could run Steel Sabotage over like Snake Form, since Snake Form is mostly for affinity.
But what does Steel Sabotage really do against affinity? It's not like most of their dangerous creatures are artifacts.
Yeah, no, and that's why I didn't run Steel Sabotage there. It's sort of worth noting, though, that Steel Sabotage is kind of doubly useful in that you can bounce the serrated arrows back to your hand to reset the arrowhead counters, but that's a very niche case. And, you know, if I'm sideboarding in serrated arrows, I'm probably not going to sideboard in Steel Sabotage 2 just to get that interaction. So, Steel Sabotage is fine. It's just counter-target artifact spell, and that is pretty important if you want to just have a hard counter for like a Mirror Enforcer or something, or a Frogmite, but in that case, I think I'd just rather have the unconditional hard counter in Deprive or Fairy Trickery.
Yeah, I agree. What about Coral Net?
Alright, so Coral Net, interesting story, and, you know, basically why I chose to go with like the Snake Form Serrated Arrows playing in my sideboard by Coral Net. I originally just picked up Mezzel Delver just as it was, and at the time Mezzel had switched over from like a Stitch Drake and a couple other things to 4 Coral Nets in the sideboard. So I was like, oh, I'll try that out. So I went into a daily with it, and the first 2 rounds I played against Stompy. I brought in all 4 Coral Nets in both rounds, and here's how the round went, right? I'd win win the first game, and then I'd sideboard in the Coral Nets. Obviously, he brought in Scattershot Archers, so he'd go like turn one Scattershot Archer, go, and then I'd play turn one Coral Net. Okay, sweet, I've got this game under lockdown. In turn two, he plays Aquarian Ranger, and all of a sudden he just got an endless stream of lands to discard to this Coral Net, and I can't do anything with my fairies because the Spellstar Sprite's on the table, and the Coral Net isn't doing anything for me. It's just letting him discard land after land to save his Scattershot Archer. Eventually he amasses a critical mass of creatures and kills me 2 games in a row. When this happened, I win the first game and I lost the second games, regardless of the fact that I had a Coral Net in hand on his critical creature in both the games. So I was like, you know what, Coral Net isn't actually doing anything for me, so I'm going to try something else. And that's why I decided to go for the Snake Forms and Serrated Arrows plan, because it seemed to work pretty well in my mono blue control deck. And it still works pretty well here now.
Any other cards considered for the sideboard? You want to
let's see. What are some other things that people are playing right now? Stormbound Geist is pretty good, but Stormbound Geist suffers the same problem in like the Delver Mirror that other cards do. Stormbound Geist cannot attack through a Spire Golem. It also can't block ground creatures, which is actually pretty relevant. Stormbound Geist doesn't block like a ninja there. That's actually pretty important in that matchup.
Yeah.
Stormbound Geist is, when it's good, it's okay. But I played against, I used to have Stormbound Geist in the sideboard, and I played him against a blue-black Trinket control deck in a daily once, and he just didn't do enough. He was fine on his own, right? My opponent had to use 2 spells to kill it, but he just wasn't fat enough to really actually do it for me. So my opponent was able to get a couple extra turns because the Stormbound Geist was not a Stitch Drake.
Yeah, I saw that match on the channel actually. I think Stormbound Geist is pretty much an anti-black control deck card, but how many black control decks are there in the meta right now?
Right, I think it's actually fine against blue-black Trinket control, and that's probably one of the big matchups where you want it in. The other big matchup you might want it in is like the blue-red Cloudpost deck.
Yes.
Because they have to use 2 removal spells on it, but like these control decks, these heavy control black decks, the blue-black Trinket control and the blue-red Cloudpost decks, they're drawing so many cards that them having to use an extra card to get rid of your dude, it doesn't particularly matter that much because they're drawing on average 2.5 cards per turn.
Yeah.
So they are going to find a way to deal with your Stormbound Geist, and it's just like, it's not that impressive to me. I'd much rather just have hard counterspells for their key cards or boomerangs for their lands.
Yeah. The last thing I was thinking about for the sideboard is protection from red fairies.
I love the protection from red fairies, but they're really only good in a couple of different matchups. They're really good against like blue-red Cloudpost, because if it resolves, they don't really have a way to deal with it other than Mold Drifter.
And serrated arrows.
And serrated arrows, but once again, they do have the serrated arrows to deal with it. They do have the Mold Drifters to deal with it. So that leaves it's good against goblins. Okay, well, I think I've already got a pretty good matchup against goblins with 4 Hydroblast post board and the counter spells and Spire Golems and Spell Stutter Sprites. That I'm not too worried about the goblins. Plus the serrated arrows post board deal with goblins. So Weather Sea Fairies, I think it has a purpose. It serves a purpose in some decks, but it's not for this deck. You don't ever want to really tap out at 3 mana to make a 2/1 on the board. It's not what this deck wants to be doing.
I completely agree. For the main deck, the Return to Ravnica block cards, Frostburn Weird and Cloudfin Raptor, do you have anything to say about them?
I think Cloudfin Raptor just hasn't really found a home yet. I do love the card. I've drafted it quite a bit, but it's just you tap out, you get a 0/1 flyer, and that's fine as a ninja target, but he's not a fairy, so he doesn't up your spell starter count, and in a Delver type deck, he's going to evolve to what at most probably a 2/3, maybe a 3/4. So he's not that impressive. Frostburn Weird is he's a card, but the problem I have with Frostburn Weird is he requires so much mana to do things that other cards just do better. Um, mostly you want to, like, let's say you're playing against Affinity. I don't ever want to tap 3 mana just to trade a Frostburn Weird with a Mirror Enforcer. It's a lot of mana to be asking me to do just to trade before one of their cards, and they just play another one, and it's like, well, I can't counter it because I had to tap all my mana to trade my Frostburn Weird for Mirror Enforcer. So, he's a very good card for stopping the aggro decks, the Stompies and Goblins and whatnot. So I think he has a place there. He's a good card, but I don't think he has a real home in this deck.
All right. Let's talk about the matchups.
All right.
And we can begin with the controversial one. The Delver matchup. Affinity matchup, sorry.
Oh, Affinity matchup. Okay.
Yeah, as I recently did this article with Marcus on Pure, where we had a pretty lopsided match where Affinity won.
Yep. Okay. So.
But you disagreed.
Yeah, you've got a weird thing going on with your mic here.
I do.
Yes.
Okay.
You're sounding like a robot to me right now.
Okay, Affinity.
All right.
What do you think?
Sounds good. All right. So, yeah, watch you guys' videos on Affinity when he was playing Affinity, or he was playing Delver and you were playing Affinity, and he said it was controversial, but I think in the about the 10 dailies that I've placed in, I've lost to Affinity once, maybe twice. So when I was watching your videos, and I was just thinking, how is Marcus really losing? What it really came down to, I think, was that I think you were just a better than average Affinity player and you were playing around the key card in the matchup is Spellstutter Sprite.
Yeah, I would hate to get a Carapace Forger spell started.
Yep. And I think you were probably playing around the Spellstutters a lot better than most people who I play against, who are running Affinity. So, yeah, definitely the key card in this matchup is Spellstutter Sprite. You have to get value out of the Spellstutter Sprite, or else you're just going to lose. They draw too many cards, or rather, they dump their hand too fast, and you just have to Spellstutter whenever you can. So, the key cards you're looking to Spellstutter here are Atogs and Carapace Forgers. Because that's really the best targets for them, right? The Atogs and the Carapace Forgers are going to present the biggest threats to you that you can reasonably counterspell with the Spellstutter Sprite. And then after that, it's really just trying to play the tempo game. You're not going to win the long game against Affinity because their creatures are just too big and you're going to run out of counterspells. You can't effectively counterspell Mirror Enforcers without hard counters. You can't effectively counterspell the Frog Mites, which are actually pretty big threats because they trade with ninjas. So the way you're going to win is in the air with Flip Delvers preferably, but also Spire Golems are okay. So,
if you were forced to give a win percentage against, if you say, is this a 60-40 matchup for Delver or a 55-45 or a...
I think that's about right. It's probably about a 60-40 for me anyway. Once again, I haven't lost to Affinity decks in dailies when I play against them.
It's interesting because when I listened to Special Kyle, he was like, "Oh, this is a very good matchup for Affinity," and then I listened to people talking about Delver, and they're like, "Oh, it's a good matchup for Delver." So
yeah,
it might just come down to play skill.
That very well may be it. It's just like, well, if you're a better driver of the deck, then yeah, you're gonna have a better matchup against the people who are just picking up Affinity because it's the cheapest deck in Pauper to play competitively. So, maybe that's it. Maybe I've just been encountering a lot of very bad Affinity players, but I have encountered a couple of good ones, and they've trounced me. Like Falco the Legend, I know, is a Affinity player, and I think I've come up against him twice now on daily events, and I think he might actually be my 2 losses. Is just that guy.
Ah. So how do you sideboard in this matchup?
So against Affinity, I want to make sure I get this right. We're going to be taking out Piracy Charms, 3 Piracy Charms, 2 Phantasmal Bears, 1 Luminous Grace, 2 Gushes, We're bringing in 2 Snake Forms, 2 Deprives, and 4 Hydroblasts. So basically, your Piracy Charms, they're not going to kill anything that's really relevant. You're not worried about killing their disciples of the Vault. Your Phantasmal Bears are just, they're outclassed by all the 4/4s. Una's Grace is just a little bit too clunky, and the Gushes are also just, they're a huge hit on tempo. You really need to be able, if you get to that high of mana, you really need to be able to leave up double counterspell protection, because you never know when they're going to be able to chain off thought casts onto you and just all of a sudden just dump 4 creatures onto the board. So that's why you're taking out the Gushes. You bring in the Hydroblast because most Affinity decks are going to be running 4 Pyroblasts in the sideboard, so you just need a counterspell to their Pyroblasts. The Deprives are brought in because Mirror Enforcer is a thing, and your spell starters can't hit the Mirror Enforcers. So you just want a couple extra hard counterspells to deal with their Mirror Enforcers. And the Snake Forms, we talked about that a little bit with the decks, with the deck list, and the Snake Form is just, basically it's killing their 4/4s that make it onto the table.
Yeah. I was thinking about something, but I lost it.
Okay.
I think we covered this matchup pretty well then, so let's move on to... so which order do we do this? Let's move on to Delver Fiend, actually.
Alright, Delver Fiend. So
I think Delver Fiend is going to improve quite a bit now when Dragon's Maze becomes legal in Pauper.
Yeah, we'll have to see. We'll see about that. I'm not convinced because Delver Fiend just, I don't know. It's a combo deck that relies on creatures, so I'm not entirely it doesn't require a whole bunch of creatures like Elves does. It's a couple of key creatures, and if your opponent can remove those creatures, then, well, what can you really do?
Just like Hexproof or Infect.
Yeah.
But finally, Delver Fiend has as many creatures as they do.
Yeah. So Delver Fiend, we're going to be taking out 3 Piracy Charms, 2 Phantasmal Bears, and we're bringing in 4 Hydroblasts and Deprive. So one of the key problems with Delver Fiend is the creatures that really matter in Delver Fiend are red. So there's instant targets for the Hydroblasts, and you bring in 1 Deprive too because it's better than the Piracy Charm or Phantasmal Bear that you're taking out. I haven't really played against this deck too much with my Delver deck, but I think that, you know, as long as you can just counterspell the Kiln Fiends or the Weed Dragonauts, or like their Double Strike spell or their Apostle's Blessing, you're just going to win because their creatures aren't resilient enough.
Yeah.
And they're obviously just not good blockers, so there we go.
Alright, so let's move on to Goblins.
Alright, so Goblins. Against Goblin, you're going to be taking out 2 Phantasmal Bear, 1 Una's Grace, 2 Gush, 1 Snap, and 1 Exclude. And this is just sort of to make room for the stuff that you're bringing in. The Phantasmal Bears can be killed by their like Mog Raiders or Goblin Sledders. Sacrifice target Goblin, target creature is +1/+1 till end of turn.
Yeah.
So, you know, they sacrifice like a Mog War Marshal to it, and they get to kill your bear. Una's Grace is just straight up too slow against Goblins. You don't have time to be discarding lands to Una's Grace, and a 3-mana cantrip is not what you want to be doing. Gush is, once again, it's too slow, so you take out both of them. So you got 1 Snap. Snaps lose their effectiveness against Goblins, and I actually sort of might be changing this to -2 Snaps instead of the -1 Exclude, but Snaps do lose their effectiveness against Goblins because they can just sacrifice the Goblin and your Snap gets fizzled and you don't get to untap the lands.
Yeah.
So, and then you take out an Exclude because it's a bit slower than the other counter spells. It does provide you card advantage against Goblins though, which is huge. But Exclude is, you know, paying 3 mana for a counter spell against a deck that's trying to swarm you with Goblins is just not good.
True.
So you're bringing in 2 Serrated Arrows. Talked a little bit about this with the deck walkthrough, but Serrated Arrows they pick off Goblins left and right. And you're bringing in 4 Hydroblasts just as a red hoser. Once again, they're going to be bringing in Pyroblasts, so you might as well bring in Hydroblasts.
Yep.
And you bring in a Stitch Trick because it just blocks everything in the deck, and they can't even really attack into it. Even if they sacrifice 3 Goblins, you still 3 for 1 to them at the very least, if not more.
So, how does this matchup play out? What's the key things to think about?
So, key things to think about this deck are spell stutters are obviously incredibly useful here. Um, you ideally want to Piracy Charm the Mog Raiders and Mog Slutters as soon as you can, or the Goblin Slutters as soon as you can, because the Piracy Charm, or the Slutters and the Raiders make your Piracy Charms and pretty much every other creature in your deck completely worthless. Because they can just, they attack with 7 goblins, and it doesn't matter which one you block. They're just going to sacrifice sacrifice the blocked ones, the unblocked ones, and just deal you a ton of damage. So, you just want to get a couple things on the board. You spell stutter a couple of goblins, and then you just race them with a Flip Delver or a Ninja or Spire Golem or something like that. You play out the Spire Golem, and all of a sudden they just really don't have profitable attacks left. You snap their key creatures like the 2/2s that you can't deal with right away, and then you counterspell them on the way back down. That's pretty much it.
I've had problems with this matchup when playing Delver.
I think you have problems when you played Goblins, period, right?
Yeah, I do. I'm scared of goblins. So do you feel this is a favorable matchup for you?
I do feel like this is a super favorable matchup for me. Every once in a while, the Goblins deck does just get these crazy draws where they're just dropping multiple creatures every turn, and I can't deal with them. But especially after sideboard, the Hydro Blast just hose everything, and then you land a Serrated Arrows, and they've got no real way to come back because they don't really have card advantage, right? Their whole purpose is to just dump their hand out on the board and just attack you and just beat you before you can even do anything about it. But this sort of plays out the same way as like burn decks do, right? If you spell stutter a couple spells, you're in a really good position to beat them because you've one for one them, and their creatures just aren't that good against when they're facing down Flip Delvers and Spire Golems and more counterspells and bounce spells.
Would you say it's better than 60-40?
I think so. I would put this at like a 70-30 for me. I'm always happy to see goblins on the other half of the table when I'm playing this deck.
Alright, somebody told me that Mog War Marshals is a key card here, that if you counter them, you are pretty set.
Yeah, Mog War Marshal.
It is hard to pronounce, isn't it?
It is. Mog War Marshal, it's a key card to counter, but it's key in a couple different ways. Because if they're spending an entire turn casting a Mog War Marshal, and you counterspell it, all of a sudden, what do they have on the board? A Mog Conscripts, maybe? A Goblin Cohort? They've got a 2/2 on the board, and you countered one of their things, and they spent an entire turn trying to cast this Mog War Marshal. So, just counterspelling a single spell that they were trying to resolve, and that was the only spell they could cast that turn, along with all the value that Mog War Marshal provides for them, it's just huge. I wouldn't say it's like an absolutely key card counterspell, but I will gladly counterspell a Mog War Marshal if given the opportunity.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to Hexproof.
Alright, so Hexproof, it's another deck that I haven't really had a great chance at playing against. Might have played against it once or twice. You're going to be taking out 3 Piracy Charms, 2 Phantasmal Bears, into his graves, and you're bringing in 3 Boomerangs, 2 Deprives, and a Fairy Trickery. Obviously, the Piracy Charms don't really have targets in this matchup. You can't even really effectively target an Aura Gnarlid. Phantasmal Bears are just going to quickly outclassed by, if they land a 1 enchantment on their dude, then a bear is outclassed.
Yeah.
And the Inno's Grace is once again, it's just a little bit too slow. It's not really what I want to be doing. I want to be able to, make sure that I'm leaving open counterspell mana. You're bringing in Boomerangs and Fairy Trickery and Deprives.
And you're looking to boomerang lands here, right?
Possibly lands, but it could also be important to boomerang like an Armadillo Cloak or something like that. The thing that is giving them trample.
Yeah.
I think that's the primary use for the boomerang. So if they manage to do like a turn 1 Glade Cover Scout or Bogle into a turn 2 Rancor and Ethereal Armor, I'm in a pretty rough spot. So what's really going to kill me there is the trample damage, right? I can chump block most of these things till the end of time. But I want to be able to boomerang these enchantments.
Yes.
Just back to their hand. But I can also make it to where I can profitably block it with the Spire Golem. Right? So if they only have a Glade Cover Scout and a Rancor and Ethereal Armor on the board, and I boomerang the Rancor, all of a sudden my Spire Golem can block it, and he doesn't even die. I think that's a pretty awesome interaction.
Why is Snap still in the deck?
Snaps are still in the deck because they do provide extra counterspells with Spellstutter sprites.
Yeah.
You can also snap their Aura Gnarlids, which isn't too bad on its own. But in all reality, you just really, with this particular sideboard, you don't really have too much else to bring in. So snaps are fine. If you just, you can also just like block their thing with a Spellstutter sprite or a Cloud of Fairies, and then snap it back to your hand, and you have another blocker the next turn.
Yeah.
So snap is fine. It's not the greatest for this matchup, but it's fine.
So you pretty much want to counter the get rid of the trample effects, and I presume the lifelink effects as well, and then raise them.
Yep, that's pretty much the whole plan. You flip a Delver and you get rid of the trample and lifelink effects, and barring all else, you try and counterspell their creatures. They don't always have the turn 1 Gladecoder Scout, so if you counterspell a turn 2 Solhana Ledgewalker, and then, if they only kept a hand with like 2 creatures in hand, which isn't that far-fetched for a Hexproof deck, then, you got rid of one of their creatures, and all of a sudden they don't have anything left to enchant. So maybe then they play like an Aura Gnarlid or something like that, and you can snap that back to their hands.
Yeah. Alright, I think that covers. How do you feel about this matchup? I know you haven't played it a lot.
Yeah, my initial impression is it's going to vary a lot on the play, whether I'm on the play or the draw. If I'm on the play, I don't think I can really lose. But if I'm on the draw, 60-40 maybe. That's what I would guess.
Let's move on to Mono Blue Control.
It's another one I haven't had a whole lot of experience with playing against as the Delver deck. I have had a lot of experience playing as a Mono Blue Control type player, though. And like as a Mono Blue Control player, I think that Delver is actually a good deck to play against. But as a Delver player, I would think that this should be a pretty easy matchup because Mono Blue Control just doesn't have a whole lot of. They're pretty slow and clunky in general.
Yeah.
So if you get a flip Delver on the board and you manage to be able to counter their Spire Golem, then they can't win. But once again, I haven't had a whole lot of experience playing with it, but I just think you're going to be able to put too much pressure on them for them to be able to deal with it in a profitable manner. Plus, you're going to back up the pressure with counterspells. So I think this is probably going to be a pretty good matchup. The sideboard plan, as I have it now, is just -3 Piracy Charm, -2 Excludes, +2 Serrated Arrows, +1 Stitch Rake, +2 Deprive. You're probably not going to win a counterspell war against a Mono Blue Control player, but you have to at least try with the Deprives. And you may be able to catch them off guard, and they don't think you have 2 or even 3 counterspells in your hand, but you do. Piracy Charms they have a target, but their only target is a Delver that's not flipped, so I don't think they're good enough here. And the Serrated Arrows, just so that you can properly arrow down their Spire Golem and swing in with a Delver. Because the Mono Blue Control decks that I'm thinking of are running like basically 4 Delvers and 4 Spire Golems as their only creatures. So, Serrated Arrows is pretty good. If you can arrow down a Delver even once, or you arrow down even a Spire Golem even once, then you've gotten a lot of value out of the Serrated Arrows. The Snake Forms are pretty much the same idea here. Did I bring in Snake Forms? I did not bring in Snake Forms.
No Snake Forms, no.
Okay. Okay, well, arrows are fine by themselves then. Yeah. I should probably bring in Snake Forms.
Okay, Mono Blue Control isn't around a lot right now, but I'm sure it will come back at some point. Right now, I checked the metagame stats on MTG Goldfish right before this, actually, and Delver was number 2 in the metagame. And number 1 was once again Stompy.
Stompy, this is just crazy to me.
Yeah, it never dies. So let's talk about Stompy.
Alright, so Stompy is, at the best, I'm going to say it's a 50-50 matchup. I think this Delver, like the controlling Delver, actually is a better matchup than the aggro, the X-Men Max Delvers do. Because this deck has answers to their creatures in the main deck, right? You're not just boned if they turn one Nettle Sentinel Rancor up, because you can answer that with like a Piracy Charms. You've got the 4 snaps, whereas the Mezzel Delvers only run 3 snaps. So you're pretty much guaranteed to draw snaps to bounce their creatures back to their hand. And you've got the Piracy Charms to deal with like Quirion Rangers and other little dinky creatures that you don't want on the board, but you can't deal with, and you can't really counterspell them either because they might just play an important creature afterwards. So Piracy Charm sort of answers like those Quirion Rangers and just little creatures that are going to ping you to death. And then you've got the counterspells and the snaps for the bigger creatures that you're more worried about. So against Stompy, the plan... where is it? The plan is currently -2 Phantasmal Bears, -1 Una's Grace, -1 Gush, -1 Exclude, +1 Stitch Strike, +2 Stratos, +2 Snake Forms. So interestingly, I changed after I went through those 2 dailies in a row where Stompy just crushed me 0-2 in both rounds, I changed up the sideboard a little bit to deal with Stompy a little bit more. And since then, I haven't encountered Stompy even once in a daily.
Wow.
So...
How does Snake Form interact with like Hunger of the Howl Pack counters and growth spells in general?
Well, in general, the Snake Form, you're looking to just get their creatures, just catch them off guard by surprise with the Snake Form. Yeah, it doesn't properly interact with like the pump spells and whatnot, but with the Snake Form, you're mostly looking to actually combine like the Snake Form with the Serrated Arrows effect. So here's what happens: you arrow down like a Nettle Sentinel or something like that, and then you Snake Form the Nettle Sentinel, and the Nettle Sentinel instantly dies. You can't respond to well, he can use a pump spell that turn to save his thing, but really the Snake Form just instantly kills anything you've arrowed. And, provided they don't bring in Hunger of the Howl Pack, or they don't Hunger the Howl Pack that card. But like I said, I haven't actually dealt with a Stompy deck since I changed the sideboard at all. I think that's how I'd sideboard, though, is the Snake Forms just bring the creatures down to size a little bit, let you trade fairies if necessary. But Snake Form's also, it's got a different function too that I didn't even think about until just now. It's the Snake Form, it takes away the unblockability clause of the Scarred and Pit Skulk. So that is not unimportant for sure.
Ah, yeah, that's nice.
So it's all right. I haven't encountered Stompy since I changed up the sideboard, but I think the Snake Form's more for the Scattershot Archers. Just they were ticking me off, and I wanted a way to be able to deal with Scattershot Archer instantly, not without having to have double serrated arrows there on counters on Scattershot Archers.
And the key card in your deck is Spell Status Sprite once again here, right?
Yeah, definitely. You want to spell starter. Primarily, you want to spell starter creatures, and just make it to where they have to use a pump spell to kill whatever creature you're blocking with. That's the idea. So if you manage to blind flip a Delver, and you can leave it behind as a blocker. So if they attack in with a Quirion Ranger, you can block with a Delver of Secrets and with a flip Delver, and they have to use a pump spell there. And that's okay. I'm willing to make that trade because the pump spell is then no longer going to my face, and I have ways to deal with it in the future. Ways to deal with their creatures in the future.
Yeah.
I guess the other use for Snake Form here that I didn't go into too much was Snake Form plus Piracy Charm. You Snake Form the creature, then you Piracy Charm it, and you kill it.
Of course.
So that works for any creature. Just wanted to get that back in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, the way the plan hopefully works out is you flip a Delver on turn 2, and you can actually race them at that point because you've got counter spells to counteract their pump spells, and they can't really race with a flip Delver whenever you're countering their pump spells.
True. Yeah. Let's move on to the Stormpost decks. Monoblue Stormpost and Simic Stormpost.
Alright, so the way these decks both play out is they both play out pretty much the same way. They have different mana generation engine, and the mono blue Stormpost decks just they're much more combo oriented than the Simic Stormpost. But the name of the game. This deck is just bringing in hard counters and just countering the key spells. So against both of them, I'm going to be taking out 3 Piracy Charms, 3 Snaps, bringing in 2 Deprives, 1 Fairy Trickery, and 3 Boomerangs. The idea here is just go all out on the aggro plan, and you play creatures and you counterspell their key cards, and like their key cards are like, for mono blue, you want to counterspell their Cloud of Fairies. For Simic Stormpost, you want to use your spells that are sprites whenever you can, because they don't have a whole lot of targets against the Simic Stormpost deck, so you want to be able to counterspell, even if you're just counterspelling like a Chromatic Star or something. You're actually denying them a filtration there. And if you can spell starter like a Crop Rotation, that's just the bee's knees right there.
Yeah,
I love spell starter
really
Crop
hurts.
Rotations. Yeah. The Piracy Charms don't really have targets, so you take them out. If they're at the best, your Piracy Charm is a shock to their face, or you can possibly make them discard a card, but that's really not that good against either of the Stormpost decks. Snapping, you're not going to be snapping their Mull Drifters. It's only creature they play if they even play it. And you're bringing in the Deprives and the Fairy Trickery just as hard counters, basically. And the Boomerangs just as a huge tempo loss for them. If you Boomerang a Stormpost at any point in the game for them, they lose a lot of tempo having to replay it because it comes into play tapped. And if you Boomerang a Cloudpost on turn 2, I don't really see the way that they win. Yeah. Especially if you got like a turn 1 Bear or a Delver, and you Boomerang their card on turn 2, or Boomerang their Cloudpost on turn 2, they just lose.
What about snapping Cloud of Fairies against the mono blue version when he tries to go off?
Yeah, that's an option too, but I think if I'm letting his Cloud of Fairies resolve, I've probably already lost there. So I don't think that's really a good play.
Oh, you're probably right.
Because if I let his Cloud of Fairies resolve, he's going to generate a lot of mana right there, and even if he only Temporal Fissures me for 2, that's a huge tempo loss for me.
Yeah. So, do you find that their very different win conditions affect the way you play against them?
I don't really think so. The mono blue, like I said, it's much more of a a combo deck. Sorry. So if mono blue's gone off, you're probably just going to lose. Simic Stormpost, if they've gone off, you can actually recover, and I have recovered from them against them on a daily when they've fissured me for like 7 or something like that. I did manage to come back and replay my Delvers, flip them. Get a ninja back on the board, and all of a sudden I was just back in the game because they hadn't quite drawn their Caravex Torch yet.
Yeah.
Or they didn't have enough mana or something like that.
And Torch is still bugged, right? So you can still counter it without paying 2 extra mana.
Yeah, your sound just messed up again. Sorry. All right.
Caravex Torch. You should pay 2 more for countering it, right? But you don't have to do that.
Yep. You don't have to do it right now. I'm wondering how much Wizards is going to continue to pay people in compensation for that, because I've definitely taken advantage of it and dodged a lethal torch by counterspelling it for 2 mana.
Yeah.
And it's not fair, but I'm not going to give away my tickets because your Caravex Torch is bugged, and I might as well counter it if I can.
But people get compensation for when their Caravex Torch.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, they do. So I'm wondering, once again, how much Wizards is going to continue to pay out in compensation before they fix Caravex Torch.
That's weird.
Yeah, it's still bugged. I've put in a bug report against it because I tried out Simic Stormpost, and it's really irritating whenever you're like, all right, I got him now. This Delver deck is tapped out. He can't pay for my Caravex Torch, and I Caravex Torch you for 20, and you counterspell it. I'm like, what? You can't do that.
That's really sad.
Yeah.
Well, how do you feel about this matchup?
So I think Delver, like the resurgence in Delver, was one of the reasons why you're seeing a lot less Stormpost and Mono Blue Post decks around now. Is because, Yeah, Delver's just. I think it's just a great matchup for Delver. You've got a clock and you've got counter spells, and they can't really do much in the face of that, right? They can answer the aggro portion, they can answer the counterspell portion, but they can't answer both at the same time.
Yeah, it's the classic rule of beating combo decks that aggro control is always the best way to beat a combo deck.
Yep.
So what do you feel? It's in 70-30, 80-20, or?
I would go so far as to say an 80-20. I hate giving anything more than an 80-20, so this is like the deck that I want to see on the other end of the table.
Yeah.
If I enter it daily, I'd love to just play 4 of these decks and just win every single round.
Yes.
So I don't really. It's pretty hard to lose, I think.
Yeah. What about Familiar Storm?
Familiar Storm's pretty tricky, but I actually think Familiar Storm's a little bit better than the Cloud Post and the. I mean, better for Delver than the Cloud Post and the Simic Stormpost matchups.
Really?
Because Familiar Storm relies on a lot of creatures, and if you can counterspell the creatures, then you just win, right? If you counterspell their familiars, they don't have the huge mana engine of the Cloud Posts. And then you've also got the additional thing here. We've got the Piracy Charms, and those target Nightscape Familiars. So even if a Nightscape Familiar resolves, you can Piracy Charm it. If they resolve a Cloud Fairies, then you can Piracy Charm it, right? You stop their snap shenanigans, and you can just kill their Nightscape Familiar, which, if you accidentally let one resolve, or you didn't have a counterspell in your hand, or if you tapped out for a ninja, you just Piracy Charm the Nightscape next turn, and it's dead, and you don't have to worry about that Nightscape anymore. And then after sideboarding, it becomes even more easy because the Familiar Storm decks rely on the Karu lands, and if you boomerang a Karu land, you just win right there because they lose like 2 turns on mana drops, but if you boomerang a Karu land, and they can't win after that.
All right. What about Iset Post, Blue-Red Cloud Post?
So Blue-Red Cloud Post is it's a very interesting matchup, and let's go over the sideboard plan first because that sort of matters a lot.
Yeah.
Against Blue-Red Cloud Post, the way I do is I take out 4 snaps, 3 Piracy Charms, I bring in 2 Deprives, 1 Fairy Trickery, and 4 Hydroblasts. So you have to walk a really thin line when you're playing Iset Cloud Post. You have to know whether you can beat them down. And that's sort of a hard thing to determine, actually, is because, if you're on the play and you can flip a turn 1 Delver and they don't answer it, then you can beat down. You just leave open counterspell mana for the rest of the game, and you counterspell the removals on the Delver. And then you counterspell the excludes. And you just pretty much don't play anything else. Because if you try to slip a Cloud of Fairies in there and they counterspell the Cloud of Fairies, all of a sudden you're not protected against their removal spells anymore. Because you don't get to untap the lands with the Cloud of Fairies. So you have to play it really carefully and not walk into their counterspells while somehow maintaining the way to keep your Delver alive. Or your Phantasm, keep your things alive so that you can beat them down. That being said, if you can land a ninja and just get it active and drawing you cards every turn, you're gonna win there. But it's really hard because they have so much removal and so much card draw that sometimes they can just start to sort of combo off and go like compulsive research into like a Muldrifter, and then they play another Muldrifter the next turn, and then another one the next turn. It's like, well, I'm out of counterspells now. I'm out of hard counterspells now, so I have to kill you. But then they play like a Glimmer Post or something, you regain 6 life, and you're like, oh, well, I can't kill you next turn now. So I think Cloud Post is actually like a 50-50 matchup for Delver.
It seems that the first turns are extremely critical.
Yep.
Will you mulligan aggressively here?
I will mulligan aggressively because getting a Delver is super important, and you can't keep a hand like a Cloud of Fairies, a Spellstorm Sprite, a Ninja, 2 Islands, and anything else, because the fairies just aren't good enough by themselves to provide enough of a clock of them. You definitely need like a Delver or a Bear in your opening hand against the Blue-Red Cloud Post decks, because otherwise they'll roll over you and kill your things before you can ever establish an offense, and then they're going to win because they have more card draw and more removal than you do. So definitely mulligan aggressively here.
I think that this might have become a better matchup for Delver because the Is It Post decks have been forced to adapt to the Fisher decks and lost some of their strengths against Delver.
Yeah, like I don't think Is It Cloudpost doesn't really have a matchup against the Stormpost decks. If I'm
Oh, they seem
saying
to
this
have,
right.
actually, after sideboarding, they are maybe 40% to win against the Fisher decks with all their land destruction. But all their land
Okay,
destruction does nothing against Delver. So they've lost
right.
like sideboard space for Delver.
Okay, so yeah, I guess they've lost sideboard space to have to deal with Fissure Storm, but I don't know because their land destruction spells, the earliest land destruction spells they have are like Stone Rain and Earth Rift and right the 3 mana 2 mana, but played some of these Stormpost decks and they can go off as early as turn 3,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know. Anyway, it's not the point. The point is It Post is it's a deck that's in decline on the metagame. It's something you have to watch out for, and I think having excludes here is pretty key because if it is a Cloudpost deck resolves a Mold Drifter, you pretty much lose on the spot
Yeah.
because they're going to remove anything else that you try and play with Flame Slashes or Lightning Bolts or whatever, and the Mold Drifter just eats your Delvers and Fairies all day long, and the only thing you can effectively swing with is Spire Golems. So, yeah, if they resolve a Mold Drifter, you pretty much lose on the spot. So it's pretty key to just counter the Mold Drifters. If they eat some of your Fairies and possibly even a Delver with a Lightning Bolt, then sometimes you just got to take it because you need to be able to counterspell the Mold Drifter.
Yeah. I think the lowest I've seen Delver be was in like November, December of 2012 when Is It Post was 25% of the metagame. And at that point they were geared to beating Delver. And then followed all the Grixis Storm decks that took down Is It Post. But I think Is It
Right.
Post was pretty well geared at that point to beat Delver, but it's not the case anymore.
Yeah, Is It Post is also it's got a bad matchup against Stompy. So, as a Stompy player, I always rolled Is It Post
Yeah.
players. So I don't know if Is It Post really has a place in the metagame right now, especially since Stompy is the top deck, right?
Yeah.
It's 25% of the metagame, so but it is something you have to be aware of, and knowing how to play against them is really important. The Hydro Blast, you're going to counter their removal spells, and you can also realistically leave open a counterspell protection if you bring in Hydro Blasts. You leave open 3 mana, you Hydro Blast their Lightning Bolt for your Delver, and then you can still counterspell a Mold Drifter next turn,
Yeah.
and that's super important.
It's definitely a
Yeah.
matchup where both sides benefit from practice.
Yes. Um, I don't think many people play Is It Post who aren't pretty well seasoned with the deck because if you're playing Is It Post and you look at the deck list as a new Pauper player, I looked at the Is It Post deck list and I'm like, how does this deck actually win? Am I supposed to like just rolling thunder you to death? Because 2/2 flyers don't really seem like they can win on their own, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, I'm not going to play that deck. It can't actually win the game. If my rolling thunder gets counterspelled, I just lose. But obviously, I'm not a Is It Post player, but that's the way I think. And but Is It Post it's definitely a deck, and it can just kill you with Mold Drifters.
Yeah. Well, let's leave that deck and go to a deck that benefits from the low amount of Is It Post in the metagame, I think, and that is Elves.
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 All right. I think I've mentioned this before, but I'm pretty sure Elves is Delver's worst matchup. If I had to take a guess, I would say 30-70
Yep.
is your win percentage against Elves. And it's got to do with a lot of things. It's just like every spell in your deck loses its effectiveness against Elves. However, I do think that this version of Delver actually is a better matchup than the XMMX Delver does because of Piracy Charms, mostly. The XMMX decks don't run Piracy Charms, and that's actually pretty important. If you can Piracy Charm like under Turn 1 Llanowar Elves, that's a really, really good play.
Yes.
So all of a sudden they can't cast 4 Elves on turn 3. So you Piracy Charm their turn 1 Land War Elves or Quirion Ranger or really anything, and the Elves deck loses a lot of its speed. That being said, you're still Piracy Charming one of their elves. Doesn't matter. They're still going to play two elves on turn 2, and then like 6 elves on turn 3. They just combo off, and sometimes there's just not much you can do about it. They're just so fast. But the key cards you're looking to counterspell against the elves deck are Priest of Titania, Timberwatch Elf, and whatever the big elf that they're running is, like a Llanowar Sentinel or a Lissalana Huntmaster. So those are your key cards that you want to counterspell, or just straight kill with Piracy Charms. If you can counterspell those, you might have a chance if you can establish a pretty quick clock, like a Flip Delver. Ninjas don't really do much against elves because their elves just chump block them all day long. And sometimes they're just going to combo off, and they're just going to Distant Melody chain you because you can't counterspell enough things. And sometimes they'll try and bait you with counterspell. So if they play a Priest of Titania and you counterspell it, they'll Distant Melody you for even like 3 cards. It's just devastating to the Delver deck. Yeah. It's a bad matchup, but what I'll bring in against, or what I'll take out and bring in against them, I'm going to take out an Una's Grace and a Gush, and bring in 2 Serrated Arrows. It's sort of one of those matchups where you give up. You don't really give up, but if you're against elves, you're like, what can I actually do against them? Well, hopefully it'll be on the play. So I'll take out this Una's Grace and this Gush. So they're not fast enough on the play. And you bring in Serrated Arrows. Hopefully you can counterspell a couple of key elves, and you plop down a Serrated Arrows, and you pick off the rest of their elves. I think most elves decks are taking out Distant Melodies after sideboard, at least some number of them. So you have to worry about the Distant Melody a little bit less. So that means you can play the Serrated Arrows pretty safely. But it's still such an incredibly hard matchup because they can throw down so many things so fast, and even 4 1/1 elves, they can just pummel you to death with them before you can do anything.
Yep, I believe you. I was surprised at how easy it was to win with elves against Delver when I played the match. Let's move on to a much easier matchup. That is Burn.
All right.
Is this easier than 80-20?
Yeah, if there's any deck that is easier than 80-20, it's Burn. So one of the key fundamentals of Burn is every card that Burn plays is worth 3 points of damage. So they're going to start off with 7 cards in hand. Ideally, those 7 cards in hand, if they draw a land every turn, are going to deal you 21 points of damage. But if you counterspell one of those cards, then they're only going to deal you 18 points of damage. If you counterspell 2 of those cards, they're only going to deal you 15 points of damage. So it starts to scale up pretty quickly, especially when you factor in the ninja's reuse of Spellstutter sprites, and the fact that you're actually putting them on a pretty quick clock, too. And they can't really win. And it just gets even more absurd after sideboard when you bring in 4 Hydra Blasts. And, when all their cards are meant to give them virtual card advantage, that is, they spend a card, deal you 3 damage, and they deny you a card later because you're dead. But they don't really get that virtual card advantage against Delver because the Delver decks just counter the spells, and they don't get that advantage anymore. Yeah. So Burn can't really win against Delver. The ways that they do win, though, if they do win, are with like a Kiln Fiend, and they cast like 6 spells in a turn, and the Kiln Fiend doesn't care whether the spell's resolved or not, and they beat down with the Kiln Fiend. That's the only realistic way that they can beat you. But you try and play around that by chump blocking a Kiln Fiend if he managed to resolve, and if you don't have a snap in your hand, which is pretty unlikely because you played 4 snaps in the deck.
You don't even have to chump block the Kiln Fiend because it can't really handle damage very well, so 2 fairies will be enough to kill it. Yeah, 2 fairies, a bear kills it, a Delver kills it. I mean, anything in the deck really kills it, so... But even that, if you chump block it till the end of eternity, that's fine too, because you're gonna counterspell the lightning bolts and the rift bolts and anything that's gonna provide you with lethal, and they can't really
play around it. They just have to go all in and hope you don't have counter spells. But if you're playing enough counter spells, you're probably going to have at least one counter spell for their card, so they can't really win here. So the sideboard plan for them, you're taking out Una's Grace and 3 Piracy Charms and 2 Snaps. You leave in 2 Snaps for those Case Kiln Fiends, and you bring in 4 Hydroblasts and Deprive just to deny them of any resources they thought they might have had. The Hydroblasts they're going to host Curse of the Pierced Hearts or the Goblin Fire Slingers or whatever they manage to resolve. And then it's also just a 1 mana counterspell against the burn deck, which is even better than the actual counterspell.
There are a few depressing videos on MagicGatheringStrat YouTube channel where I play burn against Delver, and it's just hopeless. I tried to play the control deck in the matchup, then to try to resolve the Curse or a Fire Slinger, and then just kill everything Delver plays. But not even that has worked very well.
No, you can't do it whenever Delver's just got so much control on you.
Yeah. A deck that is not played a lot right now, but it's always there in Pauper, as so many decks are in Pauper, is Mono Black Control.
Alright, so this is one I've actually never played with as the Delver deck, so I can't really provide any great insight here. Mono Black Control, from what I understand, if it's geared to beat Delver, there's not much Delver can do about it.
Exactly.
Like if they're playing the Kumbai Witches or whatever, and depending on how much main board, discard, and creature kill they're running, sometimes I guess there's just not much that Delver can do about it. But that being said, I think if you counterspell the right things, and in the pre-board games you use your snaps defensively, snap your Delver back to your hand to save them from a Doomblade or something of that nature, and then you just counterspell the key cards. If you can establish a board presence and run them out of cards in their hands, trying to get rid of when they're trying to kill all your creatures, I think you have a pretty good shot, because their creatures aren't very threatening. Black just doesn't have a whole lot of threatening creatures. What are they going to do? Play a Ravenous Rat on me and ping me to death for 1? Well, eventually I'll draw enough cards that I can deal with it somehow. Yeah. I guess the real key card to watch out for here is like the Okiba Gang Shinobi, the 3/2 ninja where you discard 2 cards if it deals you damage.
Yes.
That's pretty brutal. I've had that happen to me before when I thought I had control of the board. I was just like, I'm just going to let this Ravenous Rats ping me for 1. It doesn't really matter. And then he snaps in a ninja guy, and I'm like, whoa, what the heck just happened to me there? I just,
Yeah, it gives you a bit of your own medicine, right?
Yeah. So I think that would be how they're going to win. But I think I would win pretty much the same way. I bring in a ninja, and I get him active, and he starts drawing me lots of cards, and I just don't care anymore.
Yeah.
I'm just going to counterspell everything they try to play.
I think the key here is if the Mono Black Control plays a lot of cheap creature removal, he will be able to play like 2 or 3 removals per turn, while you can only counter 1.
Yeah.
And his card advantage is perhaps even more than yours, given all the 2-for-1s and Signing Bloods, etc.
Yeah. He does have his card draw, I think, is what's actually going to kill him, and the fact that he doesn't really have any filtering ability.
Yeah.
Right, he's got the 4 Signing Bloods, but Signing Blood isn't the greatest thing to be playing against Delver, right? If Delver puts you on a pretty quick clock,
True.
And you Signing Blood, that can actually reduce your turns to live by 1.
So what cards do you bring in?
Like I said, I haven't played against this with Delver a whole lot. I think I'd bring in 2 Deprives, a Fairy Trickery, 2 Serrated Arrows, and a Stitch Drake. Just bring in the Stitch Drake, just trying to overload them on creature removal, right? Hopefully run them out of creature removal. And the Stitch Drake is always going to have a target in the graveyard to exile against Mono Black Control.
Yes.
So that's fine. Deprives are hard counters, and I just want more control against the Mono Black Control deck. I'm just sort of trying to become the control deck here.
Yeah.
Even though their control is in their name, it's not in mine. And the Serrated Arrows, they don't have many threatening creatures, so if I arrow down their Ravenous Rats, then they can't Okiba Gang them in on me. They can't ninja me and make me discard 2 cards. So I think the Serrated Arrows are just going to be good for getting 2-for-1s or even 3-for-1s against that
A
deck.
lot of their builds actually don't play any 1 toughness creatures. Uh, no rats and no Liliana Spectres. Would you still sideboard in Serrated Arrows against such a build?
I think so, because those builds that I've seen, even if they're not running those Spectres and Ravenous Rats, they do still play Augurs of Skulls,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken.
I think some of them they're actually, because of combo witches, some are geared to not have any 1 toughness creatures.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Well, then that would be the deck that's like specifically designed to beat Delver.
Yeah, probably.
And I can't really plan my deck around a deck that's specifically designed to beat my deck.
Of course.
Because that deck just has to be awful against 80% of the rest of the metagame.
And that's exactly what happens to Mono Black Control. That when they start, they are pretty flexible, so they can be good. They can be good metagame choice because they can change so much. But if they are geared towards beating you, they won't beat. Is it Post, for example?
Yeah, they won't beat as opposed, or they won't beat Stompy, or they won't beat any number of things. Burn, I guess Burn is probably the big one.
Yeah, Burn absolutely
So,
places
yeah.
totally different demands on the Mono Black Control deck. Then they want to play Corrupt and stuff, and more discard, etc. But let's leave them behind, as they are not a big presence right now. So let's talk about another deck that is not a big presence right now, but is coming back due to the dominance of Delver, and it's White Weenie.
All right, so White Weenie, I don't like White Weenie. I know a lot of people live and die by White Weenie because it used to be a thing in Pauper, I guess.
Yeah,
and
it's a religion.
I think White Weenie was probably my first serious Magic deck. I used to play back in the days of, once we were talking about Tempest. I played the Cataclysm White Weenie deck. You remember what that was?
No.
Cataclysm is like
What was that?
Each player sacrifices everything except for 1 creature, 1 land, 1 enchantment, and 1 artifact.
Oh.
It was a rare. I think it was from Exodus, and what you did was you stuck an Imperial Armor on a Shadow creature, and then everybody sacrifices everything, and all of a sudden your Shadow creature is like a 7/7, and they can't possibly recover from that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so White Weenie, while it was huge, it's sort of like always there. It's never very good. It's at least 1 turn slower than the other aggro decks, right? It can't kill on turn 4. I'm pretty sure. Maybe it can. I guess it can. Maybe with the right draws.
I'm not.
But,
I think it definitely is. It's very rare anyway. It is slower.
So it's at least 1 turn slower than the other aggro decks, which already makes it at a big disadvantage.
Yes.
Its creatures are also pretty tiny, but that being said, I do have sort of a plan for them. Against White Weenie, and this might be a little controversial, this may not even be right, but I'm going to be taking out 3 Piracy Charms, 1 Una's Grace, 1 Gush. Once again, I'm taking out the Piracy Charms here, but I may not take those out if they're playing War Falcons. I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, I'm bringing in 2 Serrated Arrows, 2 Snake Forms, and 1 Stitch Drake. So I'm taking out the Piracy Charms because they just don't do anything against like the creatures that I'm actually worried about, like core Skyfishers with them or loyal Cathars.
Yeah.
So, well, and I think just bringing in the Snake Forms and the Arrows is better in this particular matchup. Una's Grace is also too slow, and Gush is a little bit clunky. I want to be able to leave open double counterspell protection because White Weenie is trying to dump at least 2 creatures per turn if they can. So the way that White Weenie is going to work when you're playing against them is they're going to try and dump their hand in a goblins-like manner, but you need to counter their key creatures, the 2-for-1 creatures that they're trying to play, like the Squadron Hawks, right? You want to counter that if you can. Preferably you counter anything you can with Spell Stutters. But Squadron Hawks didn't give them a lot of card advantage, and just give them things to do every single turn, and they're going to try and run you out of counterspells. The other creature that you definitely want to counter would be like a core Skyfisher, because there's a 2/3 it blocks everything in your deck, and there's just not much that you can do about it. Even if they block a Delver of Secrets with their core Skyfishers, he's going to trade. So you definitely want to counter the core Skyfishers and their 2-for-1 creatures. Not so worried about the loyal Cathars because they're ground creatures, and you're trying to kill them in the air. Yeah.
I think you're onto something here with Snake Form, actually. I think this is a matchup where Snake Form would shine.
Oh yeah, Snake Form. Snake Form is definitely an awesome tech against White Weenie. So after sideboard, you bring in the Snake Form, and you just get to kill anything in their deck. And I do mean anything. You know, a lot of the White Weenie decks think Guardian of the Gateless is their trump card in any matchup, right? If they resolve a Guardian of the Gateless, their opponent just loses. But the Snake Form is multicolored, so it can actually target the Guardian of the Gateless.
Guardian of the Guild Pact.
Guardian of the Guild Pack. I'm sorry, I've been drafting Gate
Yes,
Pack.
I know. Yeah, that would be surprising.
Yeah, I mean, they swing in with the Guardian, and you Snake Form it, and you just kill it instantly. You block it with Cloud of Fairies. It doesn't even matter what you block it with; it's dead. And you know, no other deck has a real way to deal with Guardian of the Guild Pact. Not too many other decks are running things like I don't even know what other multicolor things would take care of Guardian of the Guild Pact.
Agony Warp.
Agony Warp, I guess. Maybe Serrated Arrows takes care of it after a couple of turns, but you know, Snake Form is just awesome because you can also kill off once again the key creatures that you're trying to counter here, like the core Skyfishers. You can attack properly into a core Skyfisher, and you still get to draw a card off the Snake Form too. So kill target blocker and draw a card.
I like it.
It's just really good against White Weenie. And I have come up against him before, and I think one of the White Weenie players is one of the guys I always get this, like the guy's like, we know you don't actually play a real deck, you just play counter spells. I'm like, okay, sure. I don't know how I get this. It's like, well, anyway, we'll go over that a little bit later. So yeah, you're also bringing in Stitch Drake because it can attack profitably into pretty much anything that White Weenie is playing. It's got a fatter body, and it is going to kill the core Skyfisher. So,
yeah, I know this was one of the matchups where Steel Sabotage was brought in as well, and that was mainly because of Bone Splitter, right? Because Bone Splitter is a pretty bad card for you.
Yes, Bone Splitter is a huge pain in the butt, but if they run out of creatures, then Bone Splitter all of a sudden is just not that good.
Yeah.
So that's really what I'm sort of relying on, is that they just don't have any creatures because I'm counterspelling or snapping them all. So that's the plan really there. And if they resolve a Bone Splitter and a Squadron Hawk, I'm in a world of hurt, but it's not the end of the game because they are a much slower aggro deck. So even if they have a Bone Splitter on the board and they're just beating me down with an endless stream of Squadron Hawks, the fairies will trade with the Squadron Hawks until I draw Gushes or Excludes or Piracy Charms or just something else to get me back in the game.
Yeah. I wanted to mention the Journey to Nowhere snap interaction as well. If you have a single creature on board and they Journey to Nowhere.
Oh yeah, there is that.
You'll snap your own guy.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, they play a Journey to Nowhere, trying to target your Delver of Secret, your Flip Delver or something like that. You just snap it back to their hand, and all of a sudden they have to journey their Acacian Javelineers.
Yeah,
and that's not even like that impressive of a scenario, but it basically makes them 2-for-1 themselves. Like, I guess, what is that, a 2-for-0? I don't even know.
Yeah, you spent the snaps. It should be a 2-for-1.
Okay, it's a 2-for-1. You're right. Okay, so yeah, they Journey to Nowhere, and you snap your creature, and they exile their own creature. And that's even better if they were counting on that Journey to Nowhere, like stabilizing the board. So if they only have a core Skyfisher on board, and you snap your only creature when they play a Journey to Nowhere, all of a sudden you got rid of that key blocker, and you get to replay your creature next turn.
Nice.
That's a pretty awesome interaction.
Next deck here, and the last one before we go into the mirror, is any form of blue-black control. And blue-black control comes in At least 4 different tastes.
Yeah. So the only one I played pretty extensively against actually is Trinket control. So, but I mean, most of the blue-black controls are doing pretty much the same thing. They're trying to 2-for-1 you or 3-for-1 you, or just gain a lot of card advantage off of you in various ways, whether that be through mystical teachings or ninjas or Grim Harvest, Muldrifter shenanigans. The game plan's pretty much the same. You're just trying to... Your spell centers lose a lot of their effectiveness here. So you're going to bring in 2 Deprives and a Fairy Trickery. You're also bringing in a Stitch Drake, because you need... All these decks are running lots of removal, so you need another creature just to try and overload them on removal. So those are the 4 definite cards that you're bringing in. You're going to be taking out 3 Piracy Charms and at least 1 Snap. It's not really easy to say how many snaps you should bring in against them, because if they're like Trinket control, for example, I'm going to leave in 3 snaps against Trinket control, because I can snap Spell Stutters or even my own guys to save them from targeted removal. Boomerangs would be the other choice of card that I could possibly bring in here, but it doesn't let me untap the lands and still have counterspell protection. So, but against like Dimir Post, for example, I would be bringing in 3 Boomerangs, because I want to be able to Boomerang the Cloud Post for pretty much the same reason as Boomeranging against Stormpost decks.
Yeah.
So, ideally, it sort of goes the same way as when you're playing against the blue-red Cloud Post deck. You get a threat on the board, and you protect it at all costs, and you avoid the Muldrifters.
I think you're in a far worse spot against Dimir Post than against Izzet Post, because you don't have Hydroblasts.
That is true. That is definitely something to think about. And I don't know why more people don't play the Dimir Post variety, because I do think it's not subject to the sideboard hate that blue-red Post is.
It's worse against the Fisher decks, and it's also less flexible. So overall in the metagame, Izzet Post is a stronger choice, but against Delver, it's definitely Dimir Post.
Okay. Well, that makes more sense then.
Also, Ninja Teaching isn't around, but it's been a staple of the Pauper format, and I think one of the reasons Trinket is a lot better is that Trinket has a better matchup against Delver, because Ninja Teaching is a turn slower than Trinket, so Delver can lock Ninja Teachings out of the game, and they don't have the cheap removal that Trinket has.
Yeah. I think I've played against maybe 1 or 2 Ninja Teaching decks, and the way it always went down is they resolved the mystical teachings, but they were dead a couple turns later.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like they cast the mystical teachings, and it's too late by then.
Yes, they are way too slow for today's Pauper format.
Yeah.
So now we come to the big one, the Mirror, the most common matchup in Pauper right now. I would say, almost.
Yeah. The Mirror. So I don't have a good record with the Mirror. I'm just be straight up here. Like the Mirror is, the Mirror you have very little control over, because it's so heavily dependent on the draw of each Delver player, right? If I draw the God Hand and I'm on the play, he's not going to win. But the exact opposite is true too. If he's on the play and he has the God Draw, he wins.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to gauge the Mirror. And yeah, pretty much every time I play it, I'm like, I don't know that I actually have control of the game here. If he snaps my ninja back into my hand and then counterspells something, all of a sudden I went from he's at 8 life and I have 7 cards in hand to he's still at 8 life and I have 8 cards in hand, but all of a sudden he could possibly have 2 or more counterspells in his hand and I can't do anything for the rest of the game. So it's so swingy, but the way I usually sideboard against Delver is because the deck is so heavily dependent on who lands the most Spire Golems. I'm going to bring in, where is it? Here we go. Against Delver, I'm going to be taking out 2 Phantasmal Bears, 2 Excludes, and a Snap for 2 Serrated Arrows, a Snake Form, or 2 Snake Forms, and a Stitch Drake. So this is actually sort of one of the key reasons that I play Snake Form in the sideboard, is because I think it actually does do something in the mirror. Snake Form takes care of opposing Spire Golems. That's what usually the Delver matchups will go like is you run out of counter spells in the early draws. Both players do. One player resolves a Spire Golem, but he's going to beat him with the Spire Golem for a couple of turns, but he's not going to draw anything. The other player resolves the Spire Golem, and then it becomes a never-ending stalemate of who drew more Spire Golems and who can snap it and then have triple counterspell protection after that to get their Spire Golem back onto the play. So it's a really frustrating matchup to play against. And then you also have like the wild card factor of like days. Like do you play around the days there? Do you try and throw out the Cloud of Fairies because he could possibly daze it? And it's like I don't really know how to play it or summarize it with words, but I think you've got a couple of key cards here that you're trying to resolve. Your key cards are like Spire Golem, pre-board, and then like trying to just get ninjas and snap value out of getting the board unclogged enough to just kill your opponent. Afterboard, you're looking at resolving your Serrated Arrows and Snake Forms and a Stitch Drake, along with your Spire Golems. So it's ultimately how you're going to win. The Fairies aren't going to win the game by themselves. The Delvers aren't going to win the game by themselves because they're blocked by the Spire Golems. Same thing with the Ninjas. So you try and resolve these big impact spells, right? The Snake Form kills their Golems, and the Serrated Arrows will just kill their board, and also make it to where you can profitably attack into their Spire Golems. You just try and resolve these key spells until eventually you can establish a board presence that they can't recover from.
Do you feel that there's a difference between what kind of Delver they play?
Yeah, it's a pretty big difference, actually. I think, actually, the more aggro-heavy Delver decks are probably a little bit favored here because they run dazes, and you can't really afford to play around their days. Because if you play around their days, then, I mean, you can. If you can, then do, but if they have the days, then eventually you're going to have to play into it, unless you make it to the really late game. But by then, they could have resolved a couple of fairies and beaten you down with ninjas, and at some point you can't afford to play around their days anymore. You just have to play into it and hope they don't have it.
Is Frostburn Weird a factor in the mirror?
Yeah, Frostburn Weird's a pretty big issue, but he's not as big as you might think. The biggest problem with Frostburn Weird is threat of activation. So you are playing 2 Quicksands, and those do kind of sort of take care of the Frostburn Weirds, but not until after you've resolved like a Spire Golem or a Ninja or something like that. Well, not a Ninja, but until after you resolve a Spire Golem. And even if you do resolve a Spire Golem, he can just pump the Frostburn Weird 3 times to trade his Frostburn Weird for your Spire Golem, and he's happy to do that every single time. He's also happy to pump his Frostburn Weird to trade it with a Delver, with a Flip Delver. So, yeah, Frostburn Weird's a pretty big pain in the butt card to deal with in the mirror. So, I always hate seeing when my opponent is playing both Frostburn Weirds and Dazes, because it's like, I don't think I could really win this in the pre-board game if he's playing both those cards. Because they're just both such a pain to play around and deal with.
If the game goes really long, do you win off Ona's Grace? Is it a factor?
Yeah, it can. Una's Grace can definitely provide you with extra cards, because there's if you make it to like turn 10 plus, 15 plus, Una's Grace is eventually going to draw you enough cards that you can snap their Spire Golem, and then you can possibly draw into enough counterspells to win a counterspell war. Now your opponent's going to be thinking the exact same thing, so you really have to gauge how many counterspells do you actually think he's drawn during this stalemate, and how many have you drawn? Can you profitably snap his Spire Golem and play, run a counterspell war after you've played the snap? Because that's really a big thing. Is like you have to make the first move in the counterspell war, and that's going to set you back on mana. So But at the same time, you've been discarding lands to these Una's Graces for how many turns now? So it's like you want to have like 8 mana on the board, but you've been discarding tons of mana to Una's Grace every turn.
Oh.
So it's just, I don't remember who it was. Somebody on Twitter said that it's just a mind game. It's just an endless mind game whenever you're in the Delver versus Delver mirror.
Will time even be a factor?
Time could be a factor. It's never been a factor for me, though. I could see it being a factor, but there's certain points where he's just going to establish such a board presence, and then you've drawn way more cards than he is. So to save myself from decking, sometimes I'll just concede because I'll be losing all the time, or I'll just lose to decking myself, and I just want to have a better chance to beat him before a clock runs out too. A lot of Delver decks will run like Curse of the Bloody Tombs too, because they know these stalemates happen. So you run the Curse of the Bloody Tombs, and if your 3 Spire Golems are staring down your opponent's 3 Spire Golems, then you're going to win off the Curse of the Bloody Tomb. I haven't tried that personally. I could see where it has merit, though.
Yeah. This became a lot longer than I thought, but I think it's worth going into depth in this Tier 1 deck that's always there.
Yeah.
I don't see Delver ever going away from the metagame.
No, until they... And if they were like banned Cloud of Fairies, I could see it taking a huge hit, and then it would have to go back to towards mono blue control.
Do you really think ban of Cloud of Fairies would affect this deck so much?
Yeah, I do think so. I think it's because if you ban Cloud of Fairies, then Spellstutter Sprite stops being a thing, and if Spellstutter Sprite stops being a thing, then Ninja the D-Power stops being a thing.
Because I've seen some builds that actually cut Cloud of Fairies and still play Spellstutter Sprite.
I think those decks are doing it wrong.
Probably.
But, Cloud of Fairies is really important because you really want 2 fairies on the board, after you play your Spellstutter. Because then your Spellstutter becomes a counterspell on a stick, literally.
Yeah.
Counter target, well, I guess counter target spell less than 2 mana cost, but 2 is pretty critical because most of the really powerful things that are done in Pauper are at 2 mana.
True. Anything else you want to add about the deck?
So I've had a lot of fun playing with this deck. A lot of success playing with this deck. I really got to thank the deck's original creator of Mezzel. He established the core. Also got to thank a couple other people here. Channel Fireball, Chris Davis, introduced me to Snake Form and Serrated Arrows in his mono blue control deck, and I've taken a lot of mono blue control principles here. So thanks to him for that plan. Also got to thank you, Dan, for giving me the opportunity to record some videos for MTGO Strat, the opportunity to do this video.
Thank you.
And to everybody else who writes for Pauper, it's such a great format, and I love that it's everybody who writes for it and does videos for it is just so enthusiastic about it, and that makes it just a much more friendly format than standard or modern or anything like that. So thanks to everybody who continues to make Pauper an awesome format, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you my experience with Delver.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So what will you be up to in the coming weeks? What can we expect from you on MagicGatheringStrat?
I got bitten by the gate crash bug, but gate crash is coming to an end, so that bug is going to have to come to an end as well. I'll probably be playing the Dragon's Maze pre-release on Magic Online, and I might do a recording for it if I can figure out the beta client that they're forcing on us. But other than that, you can expect I will definitely be doing at least another daily with this Delver deck, and I might take another stab at blue-black Trinket control too, because it seems really well positioned in the current meta, especially if Stompy and Delver are the top decks in Affinity. So I'll be definitely doing more Pauper videos for MagicGatheringStrat, and possibly some Gatecrash, or rather some Dragon's Maze drafting as well.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for all your hard work and for this show, and we'll talk to each other a lot.
All right.
See you.
Thank you. All right.